Hey guys, Pastor Tanner here. Already done my sermon prep for the day, but I'm doing some additional reading for my sermon next week. My sermon next week is going to be on spiritual warfare, and I've been loving this book by Mike Heiser called The Unseen Realm. And so what I've been doing is I've just been reading through it by listening to the audio, and I can easily do that on here, and you guys could listen along if you'd like. If you don't like, I completely understand. Not a lot of people find this, intriguing, but if you are interested, here's your opportunity. I'm just going to be reading along in the book, and you can feel free to ask questions or anything like that, and I'm going to be taking notes. It's a very interesting topic, spiritual warfare and the unseen realm, and so I just want to make sure that I do it justice. Looks like I was about half through the chapter 23 last time I was reading on giant problems. And so I'm going to go with that. And then I'm going to double check the audio, make sure it's coming through clearly. I listen on 2x speed, so if you don't like that, I completely understand, but that's what I do. So
Scientific mind about God going through a woman's birth canal and enduring life as a human, having to learn how to talk, walk, eat with a spoon, be potty trained, and go through puberty. All these things are far more shocking than
Let me check this out. See how that goes.
614, and yet
Oh, it's not detecting my mic. Sorry about that, guys. Turns out your mic needs to be plugged in order for it to work. Who would have thought? So let me see if we can get this working now.
Is what Scripture explicitly affirms when it informs us that the second person of the Godhead became a man. God became a man from conception onward. The truth is that Christians...
I'm going to try to see how the audio is.
It informs us that the second person of the Godhead became a man. God became a man from conception onward. The truth is that Christians...
I'm going to try to... That seems okay. Okay, I'm going to go with it, guys. And again, if you're not interested, I completely understand. But this is how I'm doing it. So, here we go.
God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, he is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowds heard this, they were amazed at his teaching. Matthew 22, 23-33. The text does not say angels cannot have sexual intercourse. It says they don't. The reason ought to be obvious. The context for the statement is the resurrection, which refers either broadly to the afterlife or, more precisely, to the final renewed global Eden. The point is clear in either option. In the spiritual world, the realm of divine beings, there is no need for procreation. Procreation is part of the embodied world and is necessary to maintain the physical population. In like manner, life in the perfected Edenic world also does not require maintaining the human species by having children. Everyone has an immortal resurrection body. Consequently, there is no need for sex in the resurrection, just as there is no need for it in the non-human spiritual realm. But Genesis 6 doesn't have the spiritual realm or the final Edenic world as its context. The analogy breaks down completely. The passage in Matthew is therefore useless as a commentary on Genesis 6, 1-4. Despite the flawed use of this gospel passage, Christians still balk at this interpretive option for Genesis 6, 1-4. The ancient reader would have had no problem with it. But for moderns, it seems impossible that a divine being could assume human flesh and do what this passage describes. The objection is odd, since this interpretation is less dramatic than the incarnation of Yahweh as Jesus Christ. How is the virgin birth of God as man more acceptable? What isn't mind-blowing about Jesus having both a divine and human nature fused together? For that matter, what doesn't offend the modern scientific mind about God going through a woman's birth canal and enduring life as a human, having to learn how to talk, walk, eat with a spoon, be potty trained, and go through puberty? All these things are far more shocking than Genesis 6, 1-4, and yet this is what Scripture explicitly affirms when it informs us that the second person of the Godhead became a man. God became a man from conception onward. The truth is that Christians affirm the incarnation because they have to. It defines Christianity. Genesis 6, 1-4 is set aside as peripheral. But belief in a personal God, as the Bible describes, means embracing the supernatural. For the Christian, the high point of the supernatural story of Scripture, its most dramatic and unthinkable expression, is the incarnation of God in Christ. The notion that the sons of God came to earth in fleshly form ought to be more palatable than the incarnation, since it is less supernaturally spectacular. There is no suggestion that any corporeal appearance of a divine being was accomplished through incarnation, becoming an actual human. All such instances are lesser than the incarnation. This particular supernatural approach to Genesis 6, 1-4 derives from other passages that plainly have divine beings, angels, in embodied human form. For example, Genesis 18-19 is quite clear that Yahweh himself and two other divine beings met with Abraham in physical flesh. They ate a meal together. Genesis 19:10 informs us that the two angels had to physically grab Lot and pull him back into his house to avoid harm in Sodom, something that would be hard to do if the two beings were not truly physical. Another example we looked at earlier is Genesis 32, 22-31, where we read that Jacob wrestled with a man, whom the text also describes as Elohim twice. Hosea 12, 3-4 refers to this incident and describes the being who wrestled with Jacob as Elohim and Malak, angel. This was a physical struggle, one that left Jacob injured. While visual appearances in human form are more common, the New Testament also describes episodes where angels are best understood as corporeal. In Matthew 4:11, angels came to Jesus after he was tempted by the devil and ministered to him. Surely this means more than floating around before Jesus' face. Angels appear and speak, instances that presume actual sound waves being created. If a merely auditory experience was meant, one would expect the communication to be described as a dream vision. Angels open doors and hit disciples to wake them up. This particular episode is especially interesting because the text has Peter mistakenly thinking the angel was only a vision. There is a second supernaturalist approach to Genesis 6:1-4 that takes the sexual language as euphemistic, not literal. In this perspective, the language of cohabitation is used to convey the idea that divine beings, who are rivals to Yahweh, are responsible for producing the Nephilim, and therefore are responsible for the later giant plans. This approach uses Yahweh's relationship to Abraham and Sarah as an analogy. While there is no suggestion of a sexual relationship between an embodied Yahweh and Sarah to produce Isaac, and therefore the Israelites, it is nonetheless true that the Israelites came about through supernatural intervention. In that sense, Yahweh fathered Israel. The means God used to enable Abraham and Sarah to have a child are never described in the Bible, but Scripture is clear that divine intervention of some sort was necessary. The Bible's silence on the nature of the supernatural intervention opens the door to the idea that other rival gods produced offspring to oppose Yahweh's children. As we'll see in the following chapter, this belief on the part of the biblical writers with respect to either approach became the rationale for the extermination of certain people groups in Canaan. Either the giant clans are the result of literal cohabitation, or the sexual language is merely a vehicle to communicate the idea that, as Yahweh was responsible for Israelites' existence, so the giant clans existed because of some sort of supernatural intervention of rival gods. Both approaches therefore presume that the Nephilim and the subsequent giant clans had a supernatural origin, but they disagree on the means. Nephilim after the flood. Genesis 6:4 pointedly informs readers that the Nephilim were on earth before the flood and also afterward. The phrase looks forward to Numbers 13:33, which says with equal clarity that the oversized descendants of Enoch came from the Nephilim. The sons of Enoch, the Anakim, were one of the giant clans described in the conquest narratives. The text clearly links them to the Nephilim, but how is this possible given the account of the flood? The problem is one that has puzzled interpreters since antiquity. As I noted in chapter 13, some Jewish writers presumed the answer was that Noah himself had been fathered by one of the sons of God and was a Nephilim giant. Genesis 6:9 clearly wants to distance Noah from the unrighteousness that precipitated the flood, so this explanation doesn't work. There are two alternatives for explaining the presence of giants after the flood who descended from the giant Nephilim. One, the flood of Genesis 6-8 was a regional, not global catastrophe. Two, the same kind of behavior described in Genesis 6:1-4 happened again, or continued to happen, after the flood, producing other Nephilim from whom the giant clans descended. The first option, a localized flood, naturally depends on the coherence of the arguments in defense of a local flood, especially those arguments dealing with the wording in the biblical text that seems to suggest the flood was worldwide. Many biblical scholars, scientists, and other researchers have marshaled the evidence in favor of this reading. For our purposes, this option would allow human survival somewhere in the regions known to the biblical authors, specifically the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Aegean Sea. The second option is a possibility deriving from Hebrew grammar. Genesis 6:4 tells us there were Nephilim on earth before the flood, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humankind. The when in the verse could be translated whenever, thereby suggesting a repetition of these pre-flood events after the flood. In other words, since Genesis 6:4 points forward to the later giant clans, the phrasing could suggest that other sons of God fathered more Nephilim after the flood. As a result, there would be no survival of original Nephilim, and so the post-flood dilemma would be resolved. A later appearance of other Nephilim occurred by the same means as before the flood. All this sets the stage for Numbers 13. Fear of the giant clans results in a spiritual failure that means wandering in the desert outside the land of promise for 40 years. The generation who came out of Egypt is sentenced to die off outside of holy ground. The new generation under Joshua will wind up facing the same threat.
You know, this is an interesting idea, but I just don't find arguments for a regional flood compelling. And so I feel like I'm forced into the second option. But I wonder if there's a third option that perhaps it's not that they are the original, that they're new Nephilim, but maybe they are, I don't know how to put it, maybe they're just unusually large and people refer to them as Nephilim because it was part of their history, right? So maybe they weren't actually Nephilim, but people referred to them as Nephilim and said, oh, these people, they're giants, we can't go in there, right? I don't know. I struggle to think that it happened again, but I don't really know the answer because I don't think a regional flood is very compelling either. So, not really sure on either of those options. Let's see what chapter 24 says.
Chapter 24, the place of the serpent. In Numbers 13, the Israelites had arrived at the border of Canaan. Moses sent 12 spies into Canaan to report on the land and its inhabitants. They came back with the news that what God had said was true. The land was flowing with milk and honey. But then added, there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. The very next chapter of the book of Numbers tells us that, despite the miracles of their deliverance from Egypt, the people refused to believe that God would help them defeat the Anakim, sons of Anak. Because they rebelled, God sentenced them to wander in the desert for 40 years until all who did not believe had died off. Only then would God bring them back to the promised land. Who were the Anakim? Were these giants the kind of monstrous beings we read about in Greek mythology? How many of them lived in the land? The text clearly connects them to the Nephilim, but how exactly were they connected? Answers to these questions can only be understood when framed by the original ancient context of the biblical writers who put the Old Testament account of Israel's history in its final form. It is no accident that, by all accounts, this work was finished in exile in Babylon. The biblical writers deliberately connect the giant clan enemies Israel would face in the conquest back to the ancient apostasies that had Babylon at their root, the sons of God, and the Nephilim, and the disinheritance of the nations at the Tower of Babel. These incidents inform the Israelite supernatural worldview. They are at the heart of what's at stake in the war for the Promised Land. Israel will encounter two deadly forces, the descendants of the Nephilim and the people of nations under the dominion of hostile gods. The two are at times conflated in the narrative. Both must be defeated, but one in particular must be annihilated. The giants of the Transjordan. As the 40 years of wandering neared completion, God directed Moses to lead the new generation of Israelites, and the few members of the old generation whose faith had not failed, back toward Canaan. But instead of heading into Canaan from the south as before, God brought them alongside Canaan through territory to the east, the Transjordan. This was no accident. Deuteronomy 2 picks up the story. So we went on, away from our brothers, the people of Esau, who lived in Seir, away from the Harav road, from Elath to Ezion-Geber. And we turned and went in the direction of the wilderness of Moab. And the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab, or contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar to the people of Lot for a possession. The Emim formerly lived there, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. The Horites also lived in Seir formerly, but the people of Esau dispossessed them, and destroyed them from before them, and settled in their place, as Israel did to the land of their possession, which the Lord gave them. The Lord said to me, today you are to cross the border of Moab at Ar, and when you approach the territory of the people of Ammon, do not harass them or contend with them, for I will not give you any of the land of the people of Ammon as a possession, because I have given it to the sons of Lot for a possession. It is also counted as a land of Rephaim. Rephaim formerly lived there, but the Ammonites call them Zamzumim, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. But the Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, and they dispossessed them and settled in their place, as he did for the people of Esau, who lived in Seir, when he destroyed the Horites before them, and they dispossessed them and settled in their place even to this day. As for the Avim, who lived in the villages as far as Gaza, the Caphtorim, who came from Caphtor, destroyed them and settled in their place. Deuteronomy 2, 8-23. We learn several things of significance in this passage and its geography. Proceeding from south to north, the Edomites, Moabites, and Ammonites were to be left unmolested by the Israelites because God had long ago allotted that land to Abraham's nephew Lot and his grandson Esau, Jacob's brother. It is fascinating to note that giants had once lived in those territories prior to the arrival of Moses, Joshua, and the Israelites. These giant clans were known among the Moabites and Ammonites as the Emim and the Zamzumim. Other inhabitants had also been driven out, the Horites, the Avim, and the Caphtorim. These tribal groups are never themselves referred to as being unusually tall, though they surface in connection with giant clans in a number of other passages. The thing to observe here is that these giant clans had already been removed from the land promised to Abraham's descendants by the descendants of Esau and Lot, who were also descended from Abraham, like Israel. These giant clans were related to the Anakim, who were, of course, from the Nephilim. We aren't told specifically how the bloodline lineages worked, but we are told a relationship existed. Additionally, all of these groups seem to also have been referred to as Rephaim, a term that will take on more importance as we proceed. Marching to Sihon and Bashan. God told Moses to ask travel permission of the sons of Lot and Esau as the Israelites journeyed northward through the Transjordan. They received that permission and passed through. They were on their way at God's leading to what was actually the last area under the dominion of the Nephilim bloodline in the Transjordan. Moses is seemingly unaware of God's aim in this leg of the journey. Deuteronomy 2 continues as Moses sends word to the enemy in God's crosshairs. So I sent messengers from the wilderness of Kedemot to Sihon, the king of Heshbon, with words of peace, saying, let me pass through your land. I will go only by the road. I will turn aside neither to the left nor to the right. You shall sell me food for money, that I may eat, and give me water for money, that I may drink. Only let me pass through on foot, as the sons of Esau, who live in Seir, and the Moabites, who live in Ar, did for me, until I go over the Jordan and into the land that the Lord our God is giving to us. But Sihon, the king of Heshbon, would not let us pass by him. For the Lord your God hardened his spirit, and made his heart obstinate, that he might give him into your hand, as he is this day. Deuteronomy 2, 26-30. Did you catch the last line? God hardened the heart of Sihon. The wording is designed to make us think of God's battle with Pharaoh, the presumed god of Egypt. It was time for Sihon to go, but why target him? The answer to that question requires a look back into biblical history, and then a look forward into the next chapter of Deuteronomy. Let's look back first, to Abraham. In Genesis 15, one of the passages where Yahweh appeared to Abraham in the form of a covenant relationship with him, God told Abraham the following in a dream. Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Genesis 15, 13-16. God told Abraham that his descendants, the people of Edom, Ammon, Moab, and of course Israel, would live in bondage, but would one day return to the land of promise, at a time when the iniquity of the Amorites had reached the point when God was ready to judge it. Why Sihon? He was an Amorite king, but why the Amorites? The historical material on the Amorites is sparse. Broadly speaking, the Amorite culture was Mesopotamian. The term and the people are known from Sumerian and Akkadian material centuries older than the Old Testament and the time of Moses and the Israelites. The word for Amorite actually comes from a Sumerian word, Mar-Tu, which vaguely referred to the area and population west of Sumer and Babylon. The use of Amorite in the Old Testament is indiscriminate. In some passages, it is a label for the entire population of Canaan. In that sense, Amorites and Canaanites are interchangeable, both denoting non-Israelite in the land of Canaan. In other passages, its use is more specific to one people group among several within Canaan. Canaanites and Amorites were therefore generic terms used to describe the enemies of Israel. Of the two, Amorites takes on a more sinister tone in the context of the Babylonian polemic that precedes this point in Israel's story. Tarring and feathering the inhabitants of Canaan with a label that would take an Israelite reader back to the supernatural disasters of Genesis 6 and 11 would have a profound theological effect. But the connection is actually more direct than rhetoric. One passage in Scripture specifically connects the Amorites, Canaanites, to the giants that were derivative of the Nephilim. God says through the prophet Amos, Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and who was as strong as the oaks. I destroyed his fruit above and his roots beneath. Also it was I who brought you up out of the land of Egypt and led you 40 years in the wilderness to possess the land of the Amorite. Amos 2, 9-10. Note that the context for this statement is the Exodus and the conquest. That at least some Amorites were unusually tall would have been proof to the Israelites they had descended from the Nephilim, and that case, of course, was made in Numbers 13:32-33. For an Israelite, all this meant that the native population of Canaan had a supernaturally sinister point of origin. This wouldn't be just a battle for land, it was a battle between Yahweh and the other gods, gods who had raised up competing human bloodlines that were opposed to Yahweh's plan and people. Something else about Sihon factors into this interpretation. He was allied to a fellow named Og, another king of the Amorites who ruled in the region of Bashan. Og was a giant. Deuteronomy 3 tells us what happened after Israel's battle with Sihon. Then we turned and went up the way to Bashan. And Og, the king of Bashan, came out against us, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. But the Lord said to me, do not fear him, for I have given him and all his people and his land into your hand. And you shall do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon. So the Lord our God gave into our hand Og also, the king of Bashan, and all his people, and we struck him down until he had no survivor left. And we devoted them to destruction, as we did to Sihon, the king of Heshbon, devoting to destruction every city, men, women, and children. But all the livestock and the spoil of the cities we took as our plunder. So we took the land at that time out of the hand of the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, from the valley of Arnon to Mount Hermon. The Sidonians call Hermon Sirion, while the Amorites call it Senir. All the cities of the tableland, and all Gilead and all Bashan, as far as Selecah and Edrei, cities of the kingdom of Og in Bashan. For only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit. Deuteronomy 3, 1-11. For an ancient Israelite reader with a command of Hebrew, and a worldview that included the idea that supernatural opposition to Israel had something to do with pre-flood events in Mesopotamia, several things in this short passage would have jumped out immediately. None of them are obvious in English translation. First, the most immediate link back to the Babylonian polemic is Og's bed, Hebrew, Eres. Its dimensions, 9 by 4 cubits, are precisely those of the cultic bed in the ziggurat called Etemenanki, which is the ziggurat most archaeologists identify as the Tower of Babel, referred to in the Bible. Ziggurats functioned as temples and divine abodes. The unusually large bed at Etemenanki was housed in the House of the Bed, Bit Ersi. It was the place where the god Marduk and his divine wife, Zapanitu, met annually for ritual lovemaking, the purpose of which was divine blessing upon the land. Scholars have been struck by the precise correlation. It's hard not to conclude that, as with Genesis 6, 1-4, so with Deuteronomy 3, those who put the finishing touches on the Old Testament during the exile in Babylon were connecting Marduk and Og in some way. The most transparent path is in fact giant stature. Og is said to have been the last of the Rephaim, a term connected to the giant Anakim and other ancient giant clans in the Transjordan. Marduk, like other deities in antiquity, was portrayed as superhuman in size. However, the real matrix of ideas in the mind of the biblical author may be derived from wordplay based on Babylonian mythology. Second, Deuteronomy 3 mentions Og's reign over the city of Edrei. Joshua 12, 4 and 5, which looks back on the battle with Og, refers to him as the king of Bashan and living at Ashtaroth and Edrei. These terms, Ashtaroth, Edrei, and Bashan, were theologically loaded terms for an Israelite, and even for their neighbors who worshipped other gods. Ashtaroth, Edrei, and the Rephaim are mentioned by name in Ugaritic texts. The Rephaim of Ugarit are not described as giants. Rather, they are quasi-divine dead warrior kings who inhabit the underworld. In the Ugaritic language, the location of Ashtaroth and Edrei was not spelled Bashan, but was pronounced and spelled Bathan. The linguistic note is intriguing, since Bashan, Bathan both also mean serpent, so that the region of Bashan was the place of the serpent. As we saw earlier, the divine serpent, Nachash, in other words are translated, became Lord of the Dead after his rebellion in Eden. In effect, Bashan was considered the location of, to borrow a New Testament phrase, the gates of hell. Later Jewish writers understood these conceptual connections. Their intersection is at the heart of why books like 1 Enoch teach that demons are actually the spirits of dead Nephilim. Lastly, aside from Bashan being the gateway to the underworld, the region has another sinister feature identified in the Deuteronomy 3 passage, Mount Hermon. According to 1 Enoch 6, 1-6, Mount Hermon was the place where the sons of God of Genesis 6 descended when they came to earth to cohabit with human women, the episode that produced the Nephilim. Joshua 12, 4-5 unites all the threads. Og, king of Bashan, one of the remnant of the Rephaim, who lived at Ashtaroth and at Edrei, and ruled over Mount Hermon. Just the name Hermon would have caught the attention of Israelite and Jewish readers. In Hebrew, it's pronounced Hermon. The noun has the same root as a verb that is of central importance in Deuteronomy 3 and the conquest narratives, charam, to devote to destruction. This is the distinct verb of holy war, the verb of extermination. It has deep theological meaning, a meaning explicitly connected to the giant clans God commanded Joshua and his armies to eradicate. It is to that phase of the war for the land that we now turn. Chapter 20.
Yeah, Rafe, Heiser's very interesting, and so far, I'm on chapter 25, so far, I find the broad strokes of his argument to be fairly compelling, and I think it's a game changer in terms of biblical interpretation. In terms of specifics, I struggle sometimes with some of his specifics, like last 2 chapters I'm a little bit wishy-washy on. But I think some of the hermeneutic that he puts forth in terms of understanding spirituality really opens up a lot of strange verses in the Bible. And so I think, broadly speaking, he's on the right track, but when it comes to specifics, I don't know where to go. I talked to a seminary professor of mine and asked him, it was actually my Hebrew professor, Dr. Mark Futato, and I asked him what he thought of Mike Heiser, and he said Mike's a really good friend, and he thinks his scholarship is solid. So I don't know if that means anything, but that helped ease my troubled mind a little bit, because he talks about a lot of stuff that is pretty controversial. So it's interesting.
5. Holy War. The last chapter closed with the demise of the giant Og, last of the Rephaim. Israel's battles in the Transjordan bring us face to face with an issue that has troubled Bible students and scholars for centuries: the practice of extermination in Israel's war of conquest. Og's defeat is illustrative. And we devoted them to destruction, as we did to Sihon, the king of Heshbon, devoting to destruction every city, men, women, and children. Deuteronomy 3:6. Og was lord of Bashan, the region that included Mount Hermon. We saw that the verb translated devote to destruction, haram, shares the same root consonants, chet, resh, mem, as Mount Hermon, Hermon. The wars with Sihon and Og foreshadowed the logic of harem, the act of devoting something to destruction, a logic that, as we will see in this chapter, has the Nephilim bloodlines as its focus. Harem and the biblical supernatural worldview. The idea of harem is broader than warfare. Fundamental to the concept is the sanctioning of some person or thing because it is forbidden, either due to an accursed status or due to Yahweh's exclusive ownership and use. Persons or objects could be consecrated to Yahweh using this verb. No other object or person could be substituted for that which was sanctified in this sense. The death sentence for worshipping another god was described with the verb haram, Exodus 22:20. Any person guilty of this crime was accursed. The sentence could not be revoked. Yahweh was the exclusive owner of that life or thing. Joshua's harem must be viewed against the backdrop of Genesis 6:1-4 and what I've called the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Yahweh had disinherited the nations, assigning them to the rule of lesser gods. Genesis 6:1-4 is evoked by Israel's initial contact with the occupants of the land in Numbers 13:32-33, where the giant Anakim are described as descendants of the Nephilim. As we'll see in the discussion that follows, this belief is behind the conquest passages that use the verb haram, devote to destruction, to describe Israel's warfare on certain occasions. Deuteronomy 32:8-9 is the basis for the general goal of the conquest. Israel is Yahweh's elect portion of humanity, and the land of Canaan is the geography that Yahweh, as owner, specifically allotted to his people. In the view of the biblical writers, Israel is at war with enemies spawned by rival divine beings. The Nephilim bloodlines were not like the peoples of the disinherited nations. Genesis 10 clearly casts the human inhabitants of those nations as owing their existence to Yahweh, as they descended from Noah's sons and, therefore, Noah all the way back to Adam, Yahweh's first human son. The Nephilim bloodlines had a different pedigree. They were produced by other divine beings. They did not belong to Yahweh, and he therefore had no interest in claiming them. Coexistence was not possible with the spawn of other gods. Viewed against this backdrop, Joshua's harem is a holy war begun under Moses in the Transjordan, specifically against the Amorite giant kings Sihon and Og. The lives of Israel's enemies were to be devoted to destruction as an act of sacrifice to Yahweh, but just who was in Yahweh's crosshairs to this extent? The rationale of Joshua's harem. How is Joshua's harem presented to readers? As in other instances, we must return to Numbers 13:32-33 to begin. One specific line is of importance. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." The first encounter of Israel with the inhabitants of the land involves the Anakim. The report of the spies contains the sweeping comment that everyone they saw in the land was unusually tall. There are good textual reasons for not taking this statement as a literally true assessment in terms of its comprehensive nature. We've already noted that the biblical writers at times use sweeping generalizations that are not intended to be precise. For example, Genesis 15:16 and Joshua 7:7 referred to the occupants of the land as Amorites, when it's abundantly clear that there were other ethnic groups in the land. The term Canaanite is also used in the same imprecise way. Consequently, it is much more coherent to read the statements as indicating that the Israelite spies saw unusually tall people groups everywhere they went in the land. Numbers 13:28-29 supports this reading. Those verses tell us where the spies ventured: the Negev, the hill country, the sea coast, and along the Jordan. Verse 29 has the spies noting that they saw Anakim in those locations, among Amalekites, Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, and Canaanites. This point helps explain something that will become apparent as we proceed, that the lemma haram in the conquest accounts is used only of assaults in cities or locales that overlap with giant clan population clusters. There is one exception: a lone indiscriminate use of haram in Deuteronomy 7:1-2. That passage calls for an indiscriminate harem because of the indiscriminate generalization in Numbers 13:32-33. The words of Moses in Deuteronomy 7:1-2 reflect the report Moses had received 40 years earlier. Its meaning is not that all inhabitants of the land are put under harem because everyone is a giant. Its meaning is that wherever they are found, the bloodlines of the giant clans, descendants of the Nephilim, are to be eradicated. Once the conquest of Canaan actually begins, that is indeed how the term is used in reports of Israelite victories. We must allow the more precise passages to inform the generalities. The Wars of Joshua. Soon after the victories over Sihon and Og, Moses died without ever having stepped into the promised land. The leadership of the nation passed to Joshua, who was directed by God to spy out the land, then cross the Jordan from the site of Shittim and renew the covenant between God and Israel. The conquest began at Jericho, a central location in the land. A central military campaign would have the immediate effect of separating the cities of the north and south regions. It was a strategy of divide and conquer. As with Jericho, the city of Ai was devoted to destruction after the spiritual failure of the Israelite Achan. Joshua then moved south into the hill country, part of the land that the spies had surveyed and where they had seen Anakim. The southern campaign is described in Joshua 10. As for Makkedah, Joshua captured it on that day and struck it and its king with the edge of the sword. He devoted to destruction every person in it. He left none remaining. And he did to the king of Makkedah just as he had done to the king of Jericho. Then Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Makkedah to Livnah and fought against Livnah. And the Lord gave it also and its king into the hand of Israel. And he struck it with the edge of the sword and every person in it. He left none remaining in it. And he did to its king as he had done to the king of Jericho. Then Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Livnah to Lachish and laid siege to it and fought against it. And the Lord gave Lachish into the hand of Israel. And he captured it on the second day and struck it with the edge of the sword and every person in it as he had done to Livnah. Then Horam, king of Gezer, came up to help Lachish, and Joshua struck him and his people until he left none remaining. Then Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Lachish to Eglon, and they laid siege to it and fought against it, and they captured it on that day and struck it with the edge of the sword, and he devoted every person in it to destruction that day as he had done to Lachish. Then Joshua and all Israel with him went up from Eglon to Hebron, and they fought against it, and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword, and its king and its towns and every person in it. He left none remaining, as he had done to Eglon, and devoted it to destruction and every person in it. Then Joshua and all Israel with him turned back to Debir, and fought against it, and he captured it with its king and all its towns, and they struck them with the edge of the sword, and devoted to destruction every person in it. He left none remaining, just as he had done to Hebron and to Uzzah, and to its king, so he did to Debir and to its king. So Joshua struck the whole land, the hill country and the Negev, and the lowland and the slopes, and all their kings. He left none remaining, but devoted to destruction all that breathed, just as the Lord God of Israel had commanded. And Joshua struck them from Kadesh Barnea as far as Gaza, and all the country of Goshen as far as Gibeon. And Joshua captured all these kings and their land at one time, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel. Then Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, to the camp at Gilgal. Joshua 10, 28-43. This passage tells us on 5 occasions that the inhabitants of these hill country cities were devoted to destruction, along with 6 editorial comments that Joshua left none remaining. The strategy of the Israelites is apparent at this point. Israel's Cherem focused on those regions where Anakim were known to live in the land, the Numbers 13, 28-29 report, and therefore certain cities in those regions. Other people living in those regions and towns were naturally also under threat. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Joshua and his army didn't check identification, so to speak, or interview the occupants to weed out non-Anakim. When they arrived at a place under Cherem, the intent was to leave no Anakim alive. After the invasion of the southern hill country, Joshua went north and carried out the same plan. The northern campaign is described in Joshua 11. Various people groups are named in the descriptions there, who also appear in Numbers 13, 28-29, where it is explained that the 12 Israelite spies had seen Anakim, Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites. Interestingly, Joshua ran into warriors from nearby Mount Hermon in the region of Bashan as well. Once again, we are told that Joshua's armies left none remaining and devoted the cities of the region to destruction. The destruction seems wanton, but it isn't. The logic of Cherem emerges in Joshua 11, 21-23. And Joshua came at that time, and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anav, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments, and the land had rest from war. This passage makes it evident that the target of Cherem was the Anakim. It is crucial to notice that this passage refers to the hill country of Judah and the hill country of Israel. This is language that will only make sense after the tribal allotments under Joshua, which had not yet taken place, and after the country of Israel split into 2 under Rehoboam, an event centuries yet future. The book of Joshua very obviously was written long after the events it describes. The anachronistic language is important. The hill country of Judah refers to the southern campaign. Judah was the southern kingdom in the divided monarchy after Rehoboam. The hill country of Israel speaks to the northern campaign. Israel was the northern kingdom in the divided monarchy. Joshua 11, 21-23 tells us that in both campaigns the object was the Anakim. As if this were not enough of an indication to draw the reader's attention to the Nephilim bloodlines, the writer adds in verse 22, only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some of the Anakim remain. Why add that note? Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod were Philistine cities. One needs only to recall Goliath of Gath and his brothers to understand that the writer of Joshua is setting the stage for the fact that annihilation of these bloodlines would continue into David's era. Supernatural, not bizarre, orientation. The point of this brief reconstruction is not that Israelites took only the lives of the remnant of the giant clans. Others were certainly slain. The point is that the rationale for Cherem annihilation was the specific elimination of the descendants of the Nephilim. Ridding the land of these bloodlines was the motivation. If Numbers 13, 28-29 is to be believed, the Anakim were scattered throughout the land of Canaan. Joshua 11, 21-23 makes it clear that these were the peoples targeted for complete elimination, not every last Canaanite. In point of fact, the conquest narratives utilize other verbs besides Cherem that are not necessarily words for taking life. This indicates that Cherem was not the goal of every engagement. The picture that emerges when all the descriptions are woven together was that when Israelite soldiers encountered a member of the giant clans or others known to be descended from those clans, they were under Cherem. Others might be killed in warfare, but their lives were not required by the supernatural theological orientation that is telegraphed in Numbers 13, 26-33, Deuteronomy 2-3, and Joshua 11, 21-23. The unusual size of these people groups was attributed to divine origin, something a belief in the supernatural must allow. It is not, however, an excuse for a reading of the text that is cartoonish or bizarre. How tall were the biblical giants? The only measurement for a giant that exists in the biblical text is that of Goliath. The traditional Masoretic Hebrew text has him at 6 cubits and a span, roughly 9 feet 9 inches. The Dead Sea Scroll reading of 1 Samuel 17:4 disagrees and has Goliath at 4 cubits and a span, or 6 feet 6 inches. Virtually all scholars consider the Dead Sea Scrolls reading superior and authentic. Archaeological work across the ancient Near East confirms that 6 1/2 feet tall was, by the standards of the day, a giant. One scholar of Israelite culture notes that the average height of an ancient Israelite in the patriarchal period was around 5 feet. Famed biblical archaeologist G. Ernest Wright notes, at Gezer were found at least 100 skeletons from about 3000 BC, and from various graves and deposits there are many other remains of 3rd and 2nd millennia, especially from Megiddo, Jericho, and Gezer. There are no remains of any aborigines of abnormal size. This last comment is noteworthy, since these are areas where one would expect giant clan settlements. To date, there is no human skeletal evidence from Syria, Palestine, Canaan, that shows extraordinary height. The same is true of the Mediterranean world of the biblical time period. This is no surprise. The ancient Israelites, like other peoples of Canaan at the time, did not embalm their dead. Consequently, human skeletal remains from the first 2 millennia BC are not common. Of the millions of people that lived in ancient Syria-Palestine during that 2,000-year span, a few thousand skeletons have survived. The situation in ancient Egypt is proportionally better due to embalming. Moreover, people who were embalmed tended to be among the elite class, which meant their diets were better, which in turn meant better health and optimal growth. Based on examination of mummies, the average height of an Egyptian male was between 5 and 5.5 feet. That is not to say there is no evidence external to the Bible for unusually tall people in Canaan during the biblical period. One Egyptian text from the period of Ramses II, described by Pritchard in a chapter entitled Problems of Asiatic Geography, specifically makes that point. The text reads at one point, The narrow valley is dangerous with Bedouin hidden under the bushes. Some of them are of 4 or 5 cubits from their noses to the heel, and fierce of face. Their hearts are not mild, and they do not listen to wheedling. The picture that emerges from the biblical text and archaeology is that vestiges of the Nephilim bloodline were scattered throughout Canaan among a number of other people groups. The aim of the conquest was to drive out all the inhabitants and eliminate these bloodlines in the process. The thinking is foreign to us, but it was part of the supernatural worldview of the biblical writers. Israel failed, of course. It would be centuries before the sort of kingdom envisioned by Moses and Joshua would arise, and that was mostly a mess. We tend to process the Old Testament after Joshua as just a bunch of genealogies with some murder, sex, and scandal thrown in to keep our attention. There's more to it than that. A lot more. Section Summary. The wars of conquest under Moses and Joshua were supposed to cleanse the land of a competing divine bloodline and install Yahweh's own children, his inheritance, into the place he had allotted for them. Yahweh's rule on earth was to be reconstituted in Canaan. Frankly, it didn't seem much like Eden. In contrast to the idyllic beginnings in Eden, the installation of Israel into the land had been violent. Those means were necessary to revive Yahweh's original vision in a fallen world, a world full of divine and human conflict, of free imagers seeking their own will, not the will of the Creator. Yahweh could have just spoken Israel into existence in the land. He could have acted unilaterally as high sovereign to resuscitate his rule on earth. But Yahweh's decisions in the original Eden meant that he would not overturn human or divine freedom in his imagers. Yahweh had chosen to accomplish his ends through imagers loyal to him against imagers who weren't. This commitment to humanity, his original imagers on earth, is one often missed reason why, when humanity, Israel, failed to restore God's rule, God took matters into his own hands by becoming human in Jesus Christ. Consequently, in a world governed by other gods who had become hostile rivals in the wake of Yahweh's judgment at Babel, Yahweh's presence was unwelcome. There would be war. There would be death. The land had to be repossessed and made holy. Canaan would be Yahweh's beachhead of cosmic geography from which Israel could fulfill its mission. Israel would be a kingdom of priests, a conduit through which the disinherited nations of the earth would see Israel's prosperity. The surrounding peoples would hear of Israel's God, see his unmatched power, and seek his covenantal love. The nations would be reclaimed, not by force, but by free imagers choosing to turn toward the true God, the Creator and Lord of all. At least, that was the plan. We know that Israel ultimately failed. The seeds of that failure were sown in the events of the conquest. For whatever reasons, lack of faith or lack of effort or both, Israel failed to drive out their enemies. They allowed vestiges of the targeted bloodlines to remain in the land in the Philistine cities. They chose to coexist. The visible Yahweh, the angel, asks the rhetorical question, "Why would you do such a thing?" and then announces the consequence. "Now I say, I will not drive them out from before you. They will become as thorns for you, and their gods will be a trap for you." Judges 2:2-3. The name of the place where he uttered these words was thereafter appropriately remembered as Bochim, a Hebrew word that means weeping. Not surprisingly, the rest of Israel's history is a sordid rollercoaster ride. Loyalty to Yahweh, refusing to worship any other god, was of course at the heart of salvation in the Old Testament. Possession of the land is linked to this loyalty as far back as the Abrahamic covenant. The covenant at Sinai reinforced that connection. It would be due to failure in this loyalty that Israel was sent into exile, expelled from the land of promise. But Yahweh wouldn't give up entirely on Israel. The book of Judges makes it clear that he would respond to both repentance and apostasy with equal consistency. The visible Yahweh did show up from time to time, as in the cases of Gideon and Samson, but it was only with Israel's last judge, the faithful Samuel, that Yahweh's appearances became less rare. Israel's monarchy would suffer through Saul and eventually flourish under David and his son Solomon, but the monarchy thereafter crumbled, dragging God's intended kingdom into centuries of apostasy and civil war before ending in divine judgment. The terrible end would produce theological lessons. Eden cannot come and survive without Yahweh's constant presence, as had been the case in the original Eden. The kingdom of God cannot be built with human hands. As Israel reached the final stages of failure, God announced through the prophets that plans had changed. Restoring Eden would require God's enduring presence in the hearts of his children, and an ideal king who would remain loyal to Yahweh. God himself would supply the second Adam, the son of David, the perfect ruling servant. Old Testament history after the conquest is the story of what might have been. But the Old Testament, after the book of Joshua, shouldn't be read like a protracted obituary. The spiritual war doesn't end. The biblical writers have messages to communicate against the backdrop of their supernatural worldview. The stories of prophets and kings aren't just a biblical soap opera. There's an unseen reality show going on at the same time. What's playing on that channel will occupy us the rest of the way through the Old Testament. Part 6.
Woo! You see what I'm talking about? Game changer. Cherem warfare, entirely meant to target offspring of the Nephilim more than anything else. Man. Like I said, broadly speaking, I can see some of his points, but when it comes to specifics, it's a struggle. It's a struggle. Michael says, I had a vision in 1983, now I have a website on prophecy, which I started as anti-war, but since I was ignored, has evolved to political proposals on the front page. It goes in many directions afterwards. Are you interested in the link? Michael, you can go ahead and send it to me, but I don't know that I'll have an opportunity to check it out today. And then Michael asks, is that an ebook? I don't think my computer would be able to narrate like that. If my computer could narrate every book I had like this, that'd be incredible. No, it is an ebook, and he reads along with it. I just have him on double speed. Rafe says, it's hard to take it all in and make sense of things. I agree 100%. It's very, very difficult. There's a lot of good here. There really is. But it's such a radically different way of viewing the scriptures and the story of the Old Testament. So far as I can tell, if I could summarize Michael's point, he essentially says that while we're created in the image of God, so too God has a second family, right? And they're also created in his image, and they're in the spiritual realm. Yeah, hard particulars like the divine council. Exactly. It's tough. But it makes a lot of sense of really weird passages. Like, if I go First Kings 22, I believe it is. I was reading this last night. Listen to this. The king said to him, "How many times must I make you swear to me to tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" Then Micah answered, "I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd, and the Lord said, 'These people have no master. Let each one go home in peace.'" The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, "Didn't I tell you that he never prophesies anything good about me, but only bad?" Micah continued, "Therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne with all the multitudes of heaven standing around him on his right and on his left. And the Lord said, 'Who will entice Ahab into attacking Ramoth Gilead and going to death there?' One suggested this, another that. Finally, a spirit came forward, stood before the Lord, and said, 'I will entice him.' 'By what means?' the Lord asked. 'I will go out and be a deceiving spirit in the mouths of all the prophets,' he said. 'You will succeed in enticing him,' said the Lord. 'Go and do it.' So now the Lord has put a deceiving spirit in the mouths of all the prophets of yours. The Lord has decreed disaster for you." That passage makes so much sense if you buy Heiser's overall hypothesis. It makes perfect sense. And without Heiser's hypothesis, it's one of those ones you just kind of read over and you go, "That's weird." You know what I mean? And there's that. There's Job 1. There's a lot of weird passages. And so, I don't know. It's a tough one. It's sure a tough one. He's a game changer, that's for sure. Let's see.
Thus says the Lord. Chapter 26. Mountains and Valleys.
Yeah, wow. Is this real? Did this actually happen, right? Or is it just a weird one? Therefore, hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne with a multitudes of heaven standing around him on his right and on his left. The Lord said, "Who will entice Ahab into attacking Ramoth Gilead and going down to death?" One suggested this, another that. Like they're all, like it's like a town hall meeting or something. They're all just discussing. Yahweh and all these angels are just discussing stuff. Rafe says, "I forget to tell you earlier that the book Biblical Greek Exegesis by Guthrie and Duval, there is a very handy listing of what they call semantic labels." Ooh, I did not know that. Let me check if I have that one. Guthrie, Duval. I got that one. That will be very, very helpful, Rafe. We had, like I said, we had a lot of discussions on. We had a lot of discussions on this, and it created quite the firestorm, which I didn't intend. Semantic diagramming. It's in the back. Do you know what, where in the table of contents it's at? Is it one of the appendices? Worksheets for exegetical method. These look just like handouts. Or if you know the page number, that would be good too. I'm definitely going to use it because I told them this next Bible study that I would teach on the same topic. I appreciate that, Rafe. Thank you. I told them this next Bible study I would teach on the same topic and that I would detail out some of the actual word studies and all that type of stuff. But I'm going to need to teach them about semantic domains and all of those details. I'll keep that open and then I'll just look for the page number or whatever when you find it. But I'm going to continue with this crazy book.
Penetrating into Canaan and establishing itself as an independent state didn't solve the problem of cosmic geography for Israel. If anything, it sharpened the conflict. Not only was Israel surrounded by hostile nations and their gods, but there were also pockets of divine resistance from within. The period of the judges and the monarchy form a tale of military and spiritual struggle. On the ground, the Israelites were still hamstrung by the presence of the vestiges of the Rephaim Nephilim, who had escaped annihilation in the conquest, and by incursions from enemies on the peripheries. Toward the end of the last chapter, I briefly noted Joshua 11:21-23, which informed us that the eradication of the Anakim had not been total. The writer of Joshua noted in that passage that some Anakim were known to live in cities that would later become cities of the Philistines, Israel's chief enemy during the United Monarchy. Spiritually, these conflicts had high stakes, as they signaled the infiltration of other...
Riff says, look for the functions defined and illustrated in the contents. Defined and illustrated. Foundational expressions. Foundational expressions, normally main clauses, stand at the heart of any text. The designations below may be used to tag these focal elements in a passage. Related to events/actions, temporal, local, other. Wow, this is fairly detailed. Excellent. Thank you, Rafe. I appreciate that. I'm going to try to highlight this section so that I know to come back to it. Y'all check that out in the future because, like I said, I'm going to have to prepare another Bible study on that topic, and we're going to have to go into this.
Gods, siphoning off Israelite worshippers into their own cults. Since believing loyalty to Yahweh was foundational to Yahweh's protection and remaining in the land, the spiritual battle was just as much a threat as the physical one. The books of Judges, Samuel, and Kings clearly describe the military conflict. That's the one that's easy to see through modern eyes and with a modern worldview. But beneath the surface, there's a war of a different nature raging. We'll cover a few examples in this chapter. Holy ground. When Moses was told to construct the tabernacle and its equipment, the Bible tells us that God revealed a pattern for doing so. And you will erect the tabernacle according to its plan, which you have been shown on the mountain. Exodus 26:30. Earlier, in chapter 22, we discussed how the tabernacle description aligned with the divine abodes of other gods, namely from Ugarit. We need to revisit the tabernacle here, since its history prepares us for the more permanent temple, the place where the name would dwell. The implication of God having Moses follow a divine pattern is that the tabernacle tent structure on earth was to be a copy of the heavenly tent, as in heaven, so on earth. The heavenly tent prototype was the heavens themselves, as Isaiah 40:22 tells us. He is the one who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, the one who stretches out the heavens like a veil, and spreads them out like a tent to live in. In other words, the heavens and earth were conceived of as Yahweh's true tabernacle or temple. The earthly dwelling place erected by the Israelites mimicked the grand habitation of the cosmos. The tabernacle was not only the abode of Yahweh, it was also his throne room. Yahweh sits above the circle of the earth, in his heavenly tent, on his throne above the waters that are above the firmament, and rests his feet on the earth. Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Isaiah 66:1. The Ark of the Covenant was there, the sacred object associated with Yahweh's presence, his name. The tabernacle traveled with Israel during the entire journey to the Promised Land. Once Israel penetrated the land, the Ark of the Covenant, and therefore the tabernacle structure, was situated at Bethel, a name that means house of God. You know Bethel by now. It was the place where Jacob had his encounter with Yahweh and the angels of his council atop the ladder, that is, a ziggurat. It was the place where the angels of God appeared to him again when he was fleeing from Esau, his brother. It was the place where Jacob built an altar and a pillar to commemorate the appearance of the visible Yahweh. Sometime later, the tabernacle was moved from Bethel to Shiloh. Once that move occurred, it was said that the house of God was Shiloh. The Old Testament indicates that Shiloh became the place of sacrifice. At Shiloh, we see the boy Samuel encounter the physicalized Yahweh, the Word. Eli the priest later foolishly sent the Ark of the Covenant out to battle, and it fell into the hands of the Philistines, who took it to Ashdod and installed it in the temple of their god, Dagon. In a fascinating and funny incident of cosmic geography, Yahweh's presence destroyed the statue of Dagon. 1 Samuel 5:5 describes the reaction of the Philistine priests. Therefore the priests of Dagon, and all who come into the house of Dagon, do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod until this very day. This threshold was now Yahweh's geography. They dared not walk on it. Eventually the ark was brought to Jerusalem. At first, David placed it in a temporary tent he had made for it, under the assumption that he was going to build a temple for it. Like the tabernacle, the temple contains striking imagery associated with Eden. Eden was a lush garden and a holy mountain. The tabernacle's tent enclosure contained furnishings and decorations that evoked Edenic imagery. All of these motifs, tent, mountain, garden, come together in the temple, the fixed place where Yahweh was considered to dwell and order the earth and the heavens with his counsel. The temple as cosmic tent dwelling. Many readers assume that once the temple was built, the tabernacle was forgotten, or perhaps permanently dismantled. In reality, the tabernacle tent with its Holy of Holies was moved into the temple with the ark. Recall that within the tabernacle was another building, completely covered with curtains, called the Holy Place. This room was divided in two by a veil, behind which was the Holy of Holies, the room that contained the Ark. The inside of the temple also had this same type of inner room arrangement. There was one major difference, though, between the inner sanctum of the temple and that of the tabernacle. The inner area of the temple had two giant cherubim in it, standing side by side, the tips of their wings stretching across to touch each other. The effect of this was that the cherubim wings formed the seat of a throne for Yahweh, and the Ark was his footstool. The width and height dimensions between the cherubim can accommodate the size of the tented Holy of Holies. This has led some scholars to theorize that the tented Holy of Holies was moved inside the temple, erected under and between the cherubim. In the temple, the imagery of Yahweh on his throne and living in the ancient tent were both preserved. The temple as cosmic mountain and garden. The temple of Yahweh in Israel was naturally associated with a cosmic mountain dwelling like Sinai because it was situated in Jerusalem on Mount Zion, the new Sinai. Psalm 48 makes this quite clear. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. His holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion, in the far north, literally heights of the north, the city of the great king. Psalm 48, 1-2. Zechariah 8:3 echoes the same notion. Thus says the Lord, I have returned to Zion, and will dwell, literally, will tabernacle, shakan, in the midst of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem shall be called the faithful city, and the mountain of the Lord of hosts, the holy mountain. As anyone who has been to Jerusalem knows, Mount Zion isn't much of a mountain. It certainly isn't located in the geographical north. It's actually in the southern part of the country. So what's meant by the heights of the north? This description would be a familiar one to Israel's pagan neighbors, particularly at Ugarit. It's actually taken out of their literature. The heights of the north, Ugaritic, the heights of Tzafon, is the place where Baal lived and supposedly ran the cosmos at the behest of the high god El and the divine council. The psalmist is stealing glory from Baal, restoring it to the one to whom it rightly belongs, Yahweh. It's a theological and literary slap in the face, another polemic. This explains why the description sounds odd in terms of Jerusalem's actual geography. This is why Isaiah and Micah used phrases like the mountain of the house of Yahweh. The description is designed to make a theological point, not a geographical one. Zion is the center of the cosmos, and Yahweh and his council are its king and administrators, not Baal. The temple is also the Edenic garden, full of lush vegetation and animals. The description of the temple's construction in 1 Kings 6-7 is explicit in this regard. Flowers, palm trees, gourds, cypress trees, cherubim, lions, and pomegranates all adorn the temple via its carved architectural features. In Ezekiel's vision of the new temple, he saw a temple built on a high mountain, whose courts were decorated with palm trees. The interior was decorated with more palm trees and cherubim. Ezekiel's temple garden was well watered, like Eden, since a river flowed from it that supernaturally gave life to everything else. In Israel's theology, Eden, the tabernacle, Sinai, and the temple were equally the abode of Yahweh and his council. The Israelites who had the tabernacle and the temple were constantly reminded of the fact that they had the God of the cosmic mountain and the cosmic garden living in their midst. And if they obeyed him, Zion would become the kingdom domain of Yahweh, which would serve as the place to which he would regather the disinherited nations cast aside at Babel to himself. Micah 4 puts it well. It shall come to pass in the latter days, that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and it shall be lifted up above the hills, and peoples shall flow to it, and many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Micah 4, 1-2. Unholy ground. In stark contrast to the temple, the place in Israel's cosmic geographical thinking where heaven and earth intersected, there were sinister places within Canaan that became associated with the powers of darkness, specifically the vestiges of the Rephaim-Nephilim bloodlines. In our earlier discussion of the conquest, we came across the Rephaim. The Rephaim were giants. Deuteronomy informed us that the Anakim were considered Rephaim, as were the Zamzummim. Og of Bashan was left from the remnant of the Rephaim, so that Bashan was called the land of the Rephaim. Deuteronomy 3:13. Joshua 11:22 tells us that the conquest had failed to eliminate all the Anakim, that some remained in the Philistine cities of Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. The Rephaim presence persisted in the land until the time of David. The giant Goliath, who came from Gath, was a descendant of the refugee Anakim Rephaim. He had brothers too, as we learn in 1 Chronicles 20. And after this, there arose a war in Gezer with the Philistines. Then Sippai, the Hushati, struck down Sippai, one of the descendants of the Rephaim, and they were subdued. And again there was war with the Philistines, and Elkanah, son of Yaur, struck down Lachmi, the brother of Goliath, the Gitti, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And again there was war in Gath, and there was a very tall man there, and he had 6 fingers on each hand, and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He himself was also a descendant of the Rephaim, and he taunted Israel. But Jehonathan, son of Shema, brother of David, struck him down. These were born to the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David, and by the hand of his servants. Verses 4-8. The Rephaim of the Transjordan in the days of Moses were associated not only with Bashan, but also with Ashtaroth and Edrei, 2 cities that, in the literature of Ugarit, were considered as marking the gateway to the underworld. In David's time, the Rephaim were also associated with death in a more peripheral, but conceptually similar way. There are nearly 10 references in the Old Testament to a place known as the Valley of the Rephaim. On several occasions, the Philistines are described as camped there. Joshua 15:8 and 18:16 tell us that the Valley of the Rephaim adjoined another valley, the Valley of Hinnom, also known as the Valley of the Son of Hinnom. In Hebrew, Valley of Hinnom is Gehinnom, a phrase from which the name Gehenna derives. In New Testament times, Gehenna had become a designation for the fiery realm of the dead, hell, or Hades. The history of the Valley of Hinnom no doubt was part of the reason for this conception. The translated meaning of Gehinnom in Hebrew is most likely Valley of Wailing, an understandable description given the child sacrifice that took place there. The Valley of Hinnom was a place where King Ahaz and King Manasseh sacrificed their own sons as burnt offerings to Molech. These sacrifices took place at ritual centers called Tophet, burning place, and later the Valley of Hinnom became referred to by the place name Tophet. The meaning and identity of Molech, the Hebrew consonants Mem, Lamed, Kaf, is hotly debated by scholars. It is hard to see one clear association, however, as coincidental. Molech's name appears in 2 snake charms from Ugarit in connection with the city of Ashtaroth, Ugaritic, Urut, the place known from the biblical accounts about Og. Another Ugaritic text puts the god Ruhu, the patron deity of the Rephaim, in Ashtaroth as well. These texts, at the very least, inform us that there was a close religious association between Molech and the Rephaim. This makes sense in light of the geographical relationship between the Valley of the Rephaim and the Valley of Hinnom in the Old Testament. What's particularly fascinating, or disturbing, is that the location of these valleys is directly adjacent to the southern side of Jerusalem, Mount Zion, the place of Yahweh's presence in his temple. The spiritual valley. These examples are just a sampling of the cosmic geographical worldview of the biblical writers in their times. Spiritual conflict lurks behind a wide range of Old Testament episodes and practices. The conflict between the powers of darkness and the presence of Yahweh was an ever-present part of life for the ancient Israelite. Unfortunately, the biblical record is riddled with examples of Israelites being seduced by, or embracing, those powers. Israel enjoyed a united monarchy, meaning that all 12 tribes were united under one king, through the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon. The enterprise began poorly. The Israelites' demand for a king was not a call for someone who would administer righteousness within the country and bring stability. Rather, it was a rejection of Yahweh's ability to fight for his obedient people. The divine warrior of the Exodus and wars against the Anakim had been cast aside for, ironically, the tallest person on the Israelite side. Make us a king like the other nations. God gave them what they asked for, and they paid the price. Eventually, the kingdom solidified under David, the man after God's own heart. In fact, God had picked him out specifically for the task, and validated his status with a victory over a Rephaim giant, Goliath, in single combat. God went so far as to initiate a covenant with David, declaring that only David's descendants would be legitimate heirs of his kingship. That succession lasted one generation, through the kingship of Solomon. Once Solomon was gone, the kingdom split into two kingdoms, Israel, 10 tribes to the north, and Judah, 2 tribes, with its capital in Jerusalem. It was only a matter of time before each of them succumbed to idolatrous disloyalty to Yahweh. In the northern kingdom, it happened immediately. Jeroboam, Israel's first rebel king, made a rebuild Shechem his first capital city. Shechem had been the place where Joshua had gathered Israel before his death to dedicate the nation to finishing the conquest and remaining pure before Yahweh. Jeroboam set up cult centers for Baal worship in 2 places to mark the extent of his realm: Dan, which was in the region of Bashan, close to Mount Hermon, and Bethel, the place where Yahweh had appeared to the patriarchs. The symbolism of spiritual warfare in these decisions was palpable. No one faithful to Yahweh would have missed their intended contempt. 10 of Israel's tribes were now under the dominion of other gods. Yahweh would destroy Israel in 722 via the Assyrian Empire. Judah, the southern kingdom, ostensibly loyal to David and Yahweh, would also fail. They too would have kings who turned from Yahweh. The Davidic dynasty eventually collapsed, and Judah's people were sent into exile in, of all places, Babylon. We mustn't conclude that God didn't try to turn the hearts of his people back to himself. That's precisely why he raised up the prophets, after they had met with him and his counsel.
I want to look up Rephaim. Makes me think I just read my Bible and ignore half of what I read, right? Or maybe he's cherry picking. Maybe he's focusing on specific verses that he thinks teach his principle. 8 Rephaim in NIV, 18 in ESV. We should just look up the lemma. I don't need the valley though, I just need valley, valley, valley. Oh, see, NIV only uses it for valley. ESV actually translates it appropriately. There we go. Is that the lemma? Yeah. Search. Oh, that's too specific. Let's see if I can get... Oh no. Oh no. Forgot how Hebrew works. It's been a long time since I took Hebrew. I don't want that specific a one. Let's see if I can go this resource. And then I want to... No. Let's see if that'll go. Nope. Why is this so hard, Rafe? I just wanted to look up Rephaim. You know, I looked it up here in English, but I wanted to look up the lemma for it and see how many instances of the lemma in the Hebrew. But when I searched for it, it's focusing on a specific instance of that lemma, right? It's this version of it. I guess I could look up both of them and add it up. I'm just checking Halot. pertaining to pre-Israelite inhabitants of Palestine. Descriptive, not based on a person or place. See, it's kind of common in the Old Testament. And of course, there's that valley as well. The little ring means it's the lemma. You select from over here, manuscript, lemma, it shows right there, lemma, root. So yeah, the ring is the lemma. The problem is in this passage it's giving me valley of Rephaim. So my Hebrew's way out, but you can see the Rephaim's right here. So this is the valley. I can't even read that anymore, it's been so long. So I don't want that full thing, I basically just want this right there. But yeah. And then in the ESV, I found just an instance of Rephaim, but you can see the two. The two shows that it's like a specific instance of that lemma, so it's not giving me all results. I guess it's not super important for me to recognize, but it's kind of a popular word, so yeah. It just, like I said, it makes me wonder, do I just read half my Old Testament and ignore what I'm reading? Or do I just kind of put it off in the back of my mind because I'm like, oh, that's too hard to understand? I don't know. These are good questions. It's a good book. It's a good book. Here we're going to see what he says about divine counsel. And he always gives these cliffhangers, right? The prophets met with him and his divine counsel. Really?
Chapter 27.
He says.
Standing in the council. Let's face it. Few Bible readers know much about the prophets, who, after the conquest, take a backseat to David, Solomon, and maybe a couple of the judges. The average Christian reads the prophetic material only when the pastor needs a good sermon on sin or judgment. The prophets are just a bunch of wild-eyed doom and gloom fanatics. The caricature is not completely without foundation, but it fails to accurately communicate who the prophets were, why God raised them up, and what their mission was. There is a distinct pattern to Yahweh's sovereign choice of human leaders, a pattern that includes the divine counsel. Just what was a prophet? To discern the full implications of this pattern, it is vital to first understand what is meant by the term prophet. Forecasting future events was only a small part of what prophetic figures did and what they were about. Prophets were simply people who spoke for God, men and women who, at God's direction, looked their fellow Israelites in the eye and told them that they were being disloyal to the God to whom they owed their existence, and who had chosen a relationship with them over everyone else on earth. Prophets told people the unvarnished truth and often paid dearly for it. The classical prophets, that is, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, preached during the days of the monarchy, from the time of Saul onward. But God had been appointing people to speak on his behalf for much longer than that. For example, Samuel, the last of the judges, is called a prophet. Since Samuel is a transitional figure from the time of the judges to the establishment of the first king in Israel, Samuel is thought of as the first prophet. That isn't actually the case. If we define prophets simply as spokespeople for God, prophets go all the way back to the beginning. The first prophet. Eden was the dwelling place of Yahweh, the place from which he ruled with his counsel. Humanity was created to be part of God's family and his ruling council. That's not difficult to discern when approaching Genesis in its original ancient context, but seeing Adam as a prophetic figure requires moving outside Genesis. In Job 15:7-8, Eliphaz, one of Job's friends, asks Job some intriguing questions. Are you the first man who was born? Or were you brought forth before the hills? Have you listened in the counsel of God? And do you limit wisdom to yourself? The questions are obviously rhetorical. By using contrast, they each anticipate an answer of no. Of course, Job was not the first man. Adam was. Job had not listened to the counsel of God. Hebrew, sod Eloah. But the rhetorical contrast implies that Adam had listened to the counsel of God. This would make sense, given that Adam lived in Eden, the meeting place of the council, and that it had been God's intent for human beings to be his earthly children and human members of his council. Think back to Genesis 3:8, a passage I've alluded to before, in which Yahweh approaches humans as a man. When Adam and Eve violated God's command, they suddenly heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. This walking terminology suggests that God appeared to them in human form. Spirits don't walk. The text says that Adam and Eve knew it was God. There was no surprise or shock. This was an experience they'd had before. Adam and Eve were familiar with being in God's presence. We don't think of that in prophetic terms because there were no other people. But once there were, Adam and Eve would have been the mediators between God and other humans, their own children. The description of Yahweh walking is also used of God's active presence inside Israel's tabernacle, creating another link between Eden, the cosmic mountain, and the tabernacle sanctuary. One can read the Old Testament in vain for any instance where Yahweh walked around the camp of Israel, as opposed to appearing in a cloud over the Holy of Holies. And so the description here isn't describing God literally glad-handing with the Israelites. Rather, the language is another way of saying that Yahweh's abode was among the Israelites, and where Yahweh's house was, his counsel was. On the other side of the veil was where Yahweh and his counsel could be found. Enoch and Noah. The idea that walking was language that expressed presence shouldn't be foreign to us. We use it too when we talk about walking with God. Our conception is one of communion or relationship. Scripture uses the phrase for at least that much, but it could also mean more direct contact with the divine presence. And understanding the notion of meeting with God is crucial to understanding what being God's spokesperson meant. When God chose someone to speak for him, to represent him to the rest of humanity, or to his own people, they had to meet first. This is the idea behind the biblical call to service. In the Old Testament, two men walked with God, the same Hebrew verb used to describe God's walking above. They were both prophetic figures, Enoch and Noah. It is certain that these two men directly encountered God, though few details are given. Enoch is remembered in Genesis 5:22 and 24 as never seeing death. These passages note that he walked with God, and God took him. Jewish writings from the time period between the Old and New Testament do in fact connect these few words with the divine counsel. In the book of 1 Enoch, the events of Genesis 5:22 and 24 serve as the springboard to Enoch's visions of heaven and God's throne room. Enoch was considered God's mouthpiece by Jewish readers, primarily because he was the person who delivered God's words of judgment to the fallen sons of God after the Genesis 6:1-4 incident. The New Testament also reports that Enoch prophesied. It was also about these that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of unrighteousness that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Jude 14-15. Noah also walked with God according to Genesis 6:9. God spoke directly to Noah, as he had done to Adam before him, and many prophets after him. Noah was God's mouthpiece, prophesying the coming flood to his contemporaries, warning them of the coming judgment. The patriarchs. The pattern of an encounter with God or with divine council members as validation of one's prophetic status gets even clearer with the patriarchs. Since we've covered this ground in previous chapters, though not with an eye to understanding the pattern behind these events, we'll take an abbreviated tour here. The reader will surely recall that Yahweh appeared to Abraham on several occasions. There's a detail in these encounters that I have not mentioned before. In Genesis 12:6-7, we're told that Yahweh appeared to Abraham at the Oak of Moreh, which was near Shechem. Yahweh's subsequent visitation with Abraham, just before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, occurred at a place called the Oaks of Mamre. The Oak of Moreh and the Oaks of Mamre are each what scholars call a terebinth, a sacred tree that got its sacred reputation because it marked a spot where divine beings appeared. In fact, Oak of Moreh literally means Oak of the Teacher. The point behind the name would be that some divine figure teaches people or dispenses information at this location, what we commonly think of as an oracle. Because they were thought to be holy ground, places where God was present, such places were considered good places to bury loved ones. The dispensing of divine knowledge and divine decrees is of course something the biblical writers associated with the divine council. This connection will be especially transparent when we get to the classical prophets. When Abraham was still a pagan, God had chosen him to be the father of Yahweh's new earthly inheritance after the debacle at Babel, where the nations were given over to lesser Elohim. Abraham became the conduit for God's truth to the disinherited nations. Abraham's son, Isaac, enjoyed the same status, and Yahweh appeared to him also when confirming the covenant. Jacob had a number of direct divine encounters. He inherited the covenantal prophetic status of his father and grandfather. The pattern that emerges from the patriarchal sagas is that when God chooses someone to represent him, that person must first meet with God. By necessity, that meeting is with the visible Yahweh who can be discerned by human senses. In many cases, the divine job interview occurs in a place that is described as God's home or headquarters, the place where the divine council meets. Moses, Joshua, and the judges. It should be obvious that the pattern for divine approval of prophetic status holds true for Moses. Deuteronomy 34:10 makes it clear that Moses was a prophet, and his numerous divine encounters validated that status. For the Israelites, divine encounter was what convinced people that Moses was God's man. Exodus 19:9 makes the connection explicit. And Yahweh said to Moses, Look, I am going to come to you in a thick cloud, in order that the people will hear when I speak with you, and will also trust in you forever. The implication is clear. The people need to listen, and will listen to the person who is validated by an encounter with the presence of God. Divine encounter was also what initially validated Joshua as a prophet. In Exodus 24:13, just before the description of how Moses and the elders of Israel shared a meal with Yahweh on Sinai, we read, So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God. The verse implies that Joshua went along with Moses to see God. Exodus 33:9-11 makes Joshua's contact with Yahweh a bit clearer. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. And when all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise up and worship, each at his tent door. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses turned again into the camp, his assistant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. Exodus 33:9-11. In Deuteronomy 31:14-23, Yahweh specifically commands Moses to bring Joshua to the tent of meeting, where God himself commissioned Joshua to replace Moses. The classical prophets. Perhaps the most familiar initiation of a prophet into Yahweh's presence and his divine council throne room is the case of Isaiah. Isaiah 6:1-2 reads, In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings, with 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. Verse 8 makes it clear why Isaiah has been summoned. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then I said, Here I am, send me. It is important not to miss the wording of Isaiah 6:8. Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? As we saw in an earlier chapter about the divine council, the participatory nature of God's rule with his council is again evident. God is the commissioner, but the commission extends from his divine council as well. The same divine rite of passage was experienced by Ezekiel in an even more dramatic call to ministry. Instead of transporting Ezekiel to Yahweh's throne room, Yahweh and members of his entourage come to Ezekiel, who is then commissioned as Yahweh's spokesman. Ezekiel begins his book. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Kebar Canal, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. As I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming metal. And from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and above the expanse over their heads there was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of a throne was a likeness with a human appearance. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking, and he said to me, Son of man, stand on your feet, and I will speak with you. And as he spoke to me, the Spirit entered into me and set me on my feet, and I heard him speaking to me. And he said to me, Son of man, I send you to the people of Israel, to nations of rebels who have rebelled against me. They and their fathers have transgressed against me to this very day. The prophet Jeremiah fits the pattern as well. We saw in an earlier chapter that the embodied word appeared to Jeremiah to commission him for duty. To all to whom I send you, you shall go, and whatever I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, Behold, I have put my words in your mouth. Jeremiah 1:7-9. Jeremiah's dramatic call by the embodied Yahweh is quite important in the book of Jeremiah, for it serves as the basis of true prophet status. What began in the days of Moses as public validation of his call and the call of those who served with him became fixed in the minds of Israelites as a litmus test to apply to any who claimed to be God's vessel. In Jeremiah 23, we read God's own words about false prophets. Thus says the Lord of hosts, do not listen to the words of the prophets who prophesy to you, filling you with vain hopes. They speak visions of their own minds, not from the mouth of the Lord. They say continually to those who despise the word of the Lord, it shall be well with you. And to everyone who stubbornly follows his own heart, they say, no disaster shall come upon you. For who among them has stood in the counsel of the Lord, to see and hear his word? Or who has paid attention to his word and listened? I did not send the prophets, yet they ran. I did not speak to them, yet they prophesied. But if they stood in my counsel, then they would have proclaimed my words to my people, and they would have turned them from their evil way and from the evil of their deeds. Jeremiah 23, 16-18, and 21-22. The implications are clear. True prophets have stood and listened in Yahweh's divine counsel. False prophets have not. The litmus test of direct divine encounter for validating one who claimed to speak for God never went away in Israel. It was alive and well in New Testament times. The next 3 chapters, the final ones devoted to the Old Testament, will ready our minds for Yahweh's ultimate human voice. The prophets would fail in their ministry, in the sense that they were not able to preserve and revive Israel's loyalty to Yahweh. Israel's failure meant a change in Yahweh's approach to reviving his kingdom rule. The prophetic message would change to judgment and redemption, but the means was deliberately veiled. Even God's loyal angels couldn't quite figure out exactly what God was plotting. You and I have the advantage of hindsight, but we still need to know what we're looking at. Chapter 20.
I don't know if I buy it. I like Isaiah. I think that one's clear. I mean, there's angels there. Who will go for us? You know, a lot of Christians like to say that's the Trinity. I'm okay if that's the divine counsel. But I don't know if I buy that Ezekiel and Jeremiah received the same. This seems very singular. I don't see much of God speaking in terms of the council. The heavens were open. I saw visions of God. There are the 4 living creatures. Okay. Above the expanse, there was the likeness of a throne. I'm just not convinced that, because I think his argument is prophet equals has met with divine counsel, which is God and his angels. I don't know if he'd even call them angels. And I see that in Isaiah. I buy it for Isaiah. But Ezekiel and Jeremiah seem less clear. In Isaiah, you have the seraphim, and you have the voice of the Lord, whom shall I send, who will go for us? I could buy the argument that that's the divine counsel, not necessarily the Trinity. But in Ezekiel, they're hardly present. There are the 4 living creatures here. But the way Yahweh talks in Ezekiel seems very singular and not plural, right? Son of man, stand on your feet, I will speak with you. And as he spoke to me, the Spirit entered into me and set me on my feet. And I heard him speaking to me, and he said, Son of man, I send you to the people of Israel, to nations of rebels who have rebelled against me. They and their fathers have transgressed against me to this very day. And that's very scanty evidence for his theory. Yeah, he tried to make a model that... And maybe we just don't have the biblical data, right? We don't have the thorough call of every single prophet. So I struggle to see him making this fit accurately. And then Jeremiah, to all to whom I send you, you shall go. Whatever I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. Behold, I have put my words in your mouth. Nothing of the divine counsel. Nothing of us sending them. And then down here, the implications are clear. True prophets have stood and listened in Yahweh's divine counsel. So that's how I feel about that one. It's interesting, though. Yeah, I'm going to continue.
Divine misdirection. We're at a significant stage in the epic saga of God's goal for humanity, his desire to have a human family with whom he and his divine family could rule in a new Eden. Ever since the destruction of Eden, God has been at work to use men and women to restore the original vision. The most visible manifestation of that effort was the creation of a new family through Abraham and Sarah, Israel. But Israel failed miserably in its mission. From the incomplete conquest, to the splintering of the unity of its 12 tribes, to the collapse of the Davidic dynasty, into exile in Babylon, the very place at which Yahweh had decided to disinherit the nations and create his own people millennia earlier. The apostasy of his people and their subsequent exile prompted a change in Yahweh's approach to restoring his rule on earth. He could not depend on humans, though he had pledged himself to humanity's preservation. He would no more forego the role of his human imagers than he would destroy them. Because his original creation of humanity as his image had meant free will agency, his kingdom must of necessity include humanity in its recovery and in rulership, else the Edenic vision would be undermined. There could be only one solution, though it would have two strategic deployments. God understood that only he could be trusted with perfectly accomplishing his own will. He would therefore have to become man, and in addition, he would have to inhabit the hearts of his children. Residing in a tabernacle or temple was not enough. He had to indwell those who chose to follow him. The second of these strategies is the most transparent. Through the prophet Jeremiah, God announced in the days before the southern kingdom of Judah fell to Babylon that, though the kingdom of Judah would be destroyed, he was making a new covenant with his people. I will put my law in their inward parts, and on their hearts I will write it, and I will be to them God, and they themselves will be to me people. Jeremiah 31:33. Yahweh would send his spirit to indwell his people. They could not be trusted with their freedom, but he would not eradicate it, nor would he leave them without enablement. The first strategy, however, is much more cryptic. It will occupy our attention the rest of the chapter. This is not the Messiah you're looking for. Readers will instinctively realize that by this first strategy of God becoming a man, I'm ultimately referring to Old Testament prophecies about Messiah. Thoughts of Jesus naturally flow through your mind, but that's because we have the New Testament. We have 20/20 hindsight. Israelites and Jews in exile had no such thing. But the disconnection is much deeper than that. By God's design, the scripture presents the Messiah in terms of a mosaic profile that can only be discerned after the pieces are assembled. Paul tells us why in 1 Corinthians 2:6-8. If the plan of God for the Messiah's mission had been clear, the powers of darkness would never have killed Jesus. They would have known that his death and resurrection were the key to reclaiming the nations forever. Chances are good that you've heard the New Testament mistakenly read back into the Old hundreds of times. Therefore, you might be surprised to hear me say that the Old Testament profile of the Messiah was deliberately veiled. Let me illustrate. The word translated Messiah, Moshiach, is fairly common in the Old Testament. It occurs over 36 times. It simply means anointed. Lots of people were anointed in the Old Testament, particularly kings, but many of those were unscrupulous or incompetent, or both. Mashiach occurs with reference to a deliverer whose appearance would be future to the Old Testament era in only a handful of places, and some of those aren't clear as to whether the anointed is even a follower of Yahweh. And there is no Old Testament verse that has a dying and rising Mashiach. If you're thinking Isaiah 53 is the exception, it isn't. The word Mashiach does not appear in that passage. That doesn't mean Isaiah 53 isn't part of the Messianic profile. It means that the content of Isaiah 53 is just one piece of a much larger whole. The pieces were kept separate to obscure the big picture. This sheds light on certain episodes in the New Testament, such as why Peter couldn't grasp the notion of Jesus going up to Jerusalem to die. Peter believed Jesus was the Messiah. The word for anointed one in Greek is Christos, Christ. When Jesus announced he was going to die in Jerusalem, Peter didn't say, I know, I read that in my Bible. He couldn't read it in his Bible because there was no single verse for the idea. Rather, the concept of a dying and rising Messiah must be pieced together from a scattering of disparate fragments in the Old Testament that, each taken alone, don't seem to have anything like a Messiah in mind. None of the fragments reveal the final assemblage. Even after the resurrection, the disciples had to have their minds supernaturally opened to see a suffering Messiah. The risen Jesus says that explicitly in Luke 24. These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything that is written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and Psalms must be fulfilled. Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. The point is straightforward. Only someone who knew the outcome of the puzzle, who knew how all the elements of the Messianic mosaic would come together, could make sense of the pieces. Jesus had to enable the disciples to understand what the Old Testament was simultaneously hiding and revealing. It wasn't a matter of reading a verse here and there. Unfortunately, most Christians today don't understand the complexity that Luke 24:44-45 reveals. Instead, they repeatedly hear the New Testament read back into the Old. That's unfortunate, since this makes Old Testament passages say things that no New Testament writer ever quoted them as saying. Genesis 3:15 is a good example. This is the passage where God told the serpent, Nachash, that one of his offspring would bruise the heel of one of Eve's offspring, and that Eve's offspring would bruise his, the serpent's, head. This is often taken as evidence for a suffering and dying Messiah, and the Messiah's victory over the forces of evil through the resurrection. But that isn't how the New Testament cites the passage. The verse is indeed alluded to by Paul in Romans 16:20, where he mentions the prospect of the serpent being crushed, not just his head, and not just bruised. But the crushing isn't performed by Jesus, the son of Eve and risen Messiah. Rather, Paul has God crushing the serpent under the feet of believers. The account of Abraham's near offering of Isaac is another example. Not only does no New Testament author ever cite the story as a picture of either the crucifixion or resurrection, but Isaac didn't die in the incident. Some see an allusion to this passage at Jesus' baptism, when a voice from heaven announced, "This is my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased." But that isn't what the voice said in Genesis 22. These Old Testament passages and others have been made by modern commentators to speak about the Messiah and his work in ways the New Testament authors don't claim. We shouldn't create connections where the biblical text doesn't. Instead, we need to think more carefully about what we do find in the text. God's plan to redeem humanity, reclaim the nations, and revive Eden depended on the incarnation of the second Yahweh figure and his subsequent death and resurrection. The story of the cross is the biblical theological catalyst to God's plan for regaining all that was lost in Eden. It couldn't be emblazoned across the Old Testament in transparent statements. It had to be expressed in sophisticated and cryptic ways to ensure that the powers of darkness would be misled. And it was. Even the angels didn't know the plan. Hidden in plain sight. I want now to give you a glimpse of God's secret plan for the hope of Israel and the disinherited nations. In biblical theology, all humanity. We'll focus on simple but fundamental pieces of the Messianic mosaic that form meaningful patterns of thought. Let's begin with Adam. The obvious description for his role and identity is the first man. But look at Adam a bit more closely. If I asked, how is Adam cast in the biblical story? Some other ways of thinking about Adam present themselves. Adam was the son of God. As son of the king, God, he was royalty. He was his father's designated ruler in Eden. He was also put in the garden to work the land. One Hebrew lemma for his activity is avad, consonants, ayin, bet, dalet. Once expelled from the garden, he was displaced from God's kingdom to suffer. Working the garden became a difficult drudgery. But that isn't all. Adam lost his earthly immortality. He died. But Scripture is careful to note, via the genealogies, that his lineage lived on, most precariously through Noah, all the way to Abraham, and then Israel, and finally to Jesus. His eternal life is guaranteed by God's power, and his bodily return to the new Eden depends on the resurrection of Christ, the firstborn from the dead. We could summarize Adam's profile this way. Chart. Adam, son of God, ruler king, governs in God's place. Servant, avad, suffers effects of sin. Exile in death, ceases to exist on earth. Lives through descendants, resurrection contingent. End chart. Now let's think about Israel. In terms of descent, Israelites trace their heritage back to Adam. But a closer examination of the story of the nation produces remarkable similarities to Adam's profile. God calls the nation his son. Israel is not only the light to the nation, but God intended Israel to rule over the nations. This only makes sense given that God is ruler of the nations and Israel is his son. This vision, of course, will be tied to the messianic heir of David. Israel, corporately, is referred to as God's servant, Avid, Lema, Ayin, Bet, Dalet. Like Adam, Israel's transgressions led to exile from the place where the divine presence resided. The result is suffering, many times over, under foreign powers and wicked kings. Eventually, Israel is exiled and ceases to exist as a nation. But the prophets foretold Israel's resurrection most vividly through the vision of the dry bones. The nation is reborn after the exile in the form of the returning inhabitants of Judah from Babylon. Israel's profile looks familiar. Chart comparing Adam to Israel. Adam, son of God. Israel, son of God. Adam, ruler king, governs in God's place. Israel, highest among nations. Israel's king is most high. Adam, servant. Ayin, Bet, Dalet. Israel, servant. Ayin, Bet, Dalet. Adam, suffers effect of sin. Israel, suffers effect of sin. Adam, exile in death, ceases to exist on earth. Israel, exile in death, ceases to exist on earth. Adam, lives on with God and through descendants, resurrection contingent. Israel, lives on through Judah, resurrection contingent. End chart. Next, Moses. As a believing Israelite, Moses was a son of Abraham and therefore of God. His status in that regard was special since he was God's appointed deliverer ruler of the nation. Curiously, Yahweh tells him that he will be as God, a God, Elohim, to Pharaoh, and to Moses' brother Aaron. It would be through Moses, of course, that God's signs and wonders would be wielded against Egypt. As a leader through whom flowed divine power, he would naturally come to be seen by the Israelites as a quasi-divine figure, though he was just a man. Moses is called the servant of God. Avid, Lema, Ayin, Bet, Dalet. He suffers for his sin and is prohibited from entering the promised land, though God permits him to see it from a distance before his death. The Transfiguration informs us that Moses lived on with God, but, as with everyone else, his resurrection in a new Eden was contingent on one who was to come. We can now add Moses to our table. Chart. Comparison of Adam, Israel, and Moses. Adam, Israel, and Moses are all son of God. Adam is ruler king, governs in God's place. Israel is highest among nations. Israel's king is most high. Moses is ruler king over God's people. Adam, Israel, and Moses are all referred to by the term servant. Ayin, Bet, Dalet. All three suffer an effect of sin. All three experience exile and death, ceasing to exist on earth. And all three have a contingent resurrection, with Adam living on with God and through descendants, Israel living on through Judah, and Moses living on with God. End chart. We now come to Israel's king. Recall that God had promised David an everlasting dynastic succession in what we now call the Davidic covenant. The fulfillment of this promise would fail in the Old Testament era due to the death of Israel in exile. But Israel's resurrection through Judah, the tribe of David, would keep the promise alive. As we'll see in more detail later, the fulfillment of the promise would be inaugurated at the first coming of Jesus, Yahweh incarnate. The consummation of the promise is yet future. For our purposes here, how do the patterns emerge in Israelite Davidic kingship and the Messianic son of David? Like Moses and all believing Israelites, David was an earthly son of Yahweh. But we learn from certain Psalms that the kings of David's line were also called son of God, in an act of anointed adoption specific to the enthroned king. The king was Yahweh's anointed, Mashiach, descendant of Judah, his ruling representative among his earthly children. As with Moses, the kingship, by virtue of this adopted language, carried with it a quasi-divine aspect. Psalm 89:27 casts the throne of David as the Most High, Elyon, among the nations. The ultimate son of David, it was presumed, would be a prophet like unto Moses. Not only were Adam, Moses, and Israel corporately God's servant, but King David was Yahweh's servant, Aved, Lema, Ayin, Bet, Dalet, as were other godly kings. One particular branch or offshoot from the tribe of Judah and David's line would be the individual servant God would use to bring salvation to Israel. Like the corporate servant Israel, this individual servant would suffer and die, but yet live to see his offspring, a multitude made righteous by his service. The picture of Messiah begins to appear. Chart. Comparison of Adam, Israel, Moses, and Moses lives on with God and a contingent resurrection, and the King Messiah is resurrected by the power and plan of God. All who are his from Israel and all nations will rise and rule with him. End chart. The identity and purpose of the Messiah are unknowable from a biblical verse, and even many Bible verses. The profile proceeds along conceptual trajectories that eventually merge into a portrait. And so Jesus' question to the two men on the road to Emmaus makes imminent sense. Was it not necessary that the Christ suffer these things and enter into his glory? Yes, of course it was. It's just hard to see that unless you know what you're looking for. The messianic portrait can only be discerned by assembling 100 terms, phrases, metaphors, and symbols, which themselves take on meaning only when their patterns and convergences are detected. There are a few other pieces to show you. They deserve a chapter all their own. Chapter 29.
I buy pretty much all of that. I mean, this is standard Christology. And I like the veiled nature. I think it's clear. I've been preaching through Mark, and Jesus all the time is trying to hide his identity. I think that's on purpose. And I think phrases like things which angels desire to peer into, and phrases like that, I think they all reveal that aspect. So I think that chapter's on point. I have no issues there.
The rider of the clouds. Our last chapter focused on a few of the fundamental elements of the Old Testament's messianic mosaic. One of those elements was kingship. I noted that Israelite kingship possessed a quasi-divine flavor. This was common throughout the ancient Near East. Civilizations believed that kingship was instituted by the gods, and therefore the king was a descendant of the gods. What that meant and how it worked varied. In Israel's case, the human king was chosen or adopted into the role of the son of God to carry out Yahweh's rule. This official status was legitimized to only one dynasty in Israel, the line of David. Although it's clear how that would be important to a messianic claim, it leaves us with an important question. Would the Messiah be truly divine, Yahweh incarnate, or would he be merely a man thought to be divine?
Creator-creature distinction. How do I want to open this? Let me try. I mean, surely Chrome can do it. Or I'll do Firefox. I don't see it, Rafe. It's not coming through. Let me come to YouTube specifically and try to find the link, because I'm just copying what you're putting down to me. No problem. I'm going to continue.
By adoption. By the time of Jesus' birth as God incarnate, Jews were intellectually acclimated to the idea of Yahweh being, at least in human form, including being embodied. The incarnation takes that notion another step. There is indeed a clear indication from the Old Testament that Israel's final Davidic ruler would be God become man, an idea reinforced by the New Testament, particularly in one telling scene, the Divine Council meeting of Daniel 7. All roads seem to intersect somewhere with the Divine Council. The divine nature of the Messiah is no exception. The idea derives from a Divine Council scene in Daniel 7. The scene begins with an odd vision. Daniel sees 4 beasts coming out of the sea. The 4th beast is the most terrifying and imposing. We learn that the 4 beasts represent 4 empires, as had been the case with Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 2. What's described next is significant. I continued watching until thrones were placed, and an Ancient of Days sat. His clothing was like white snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool, and his throne was a flame of fire, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued forth and flowed from his presence. Thousands upon thousands served him, and 10,000 upon 10,000 stood before him. The judge sat, and the books were open. Daniel 7, 9-10. Several things jump out at us right away. First, we know that the Ancient of Days is the God of Israel because the description of his throne as fiery and having wheels matches that of the vision of Ezekiel 1. Ezekiel's vision also included a human figure on the throne of God. Second, there are many thrones in heaven, not just one. Thrones were set up. These thrones mark the presence of the Divine Council. Third, the council is called to session to decide the fate of the beasts, national empires. The decision of the council to slay the 4th beast and remove the dominion of all the beasts is important for eschatology, but that's peripheral to our focus here. Daniel 7, 13-14 moves us forward in our pursuit of a truly divine Messiah. Daniel says, I continued watching in the visions of the night, and look, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all the peoples, the nations, and languages would serve him. His dominion is a dominion without end, that will not cease, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. There's a lot to unpack here. It's clear from the text that the Ancient of Days, the God of Israel, and the one like a son of man are different characters in the scene. Son of man is a fairly frequent phrase in the Old Testament. Ezekiel, for example, is called son of man dozens of times in the book of Ezekiel. The phrase simply means human one. And so Daniel 7:13 describes someone who appeared human, coming on or with the clouds to the Ancient of Days. It is that description that points in the direction of a second deity figure in the scene. We are back to the concept of 2 Yahweh figures we saw earlier in the Old Testament. The Cloud Rider. The first thing we need to understand is the wider ancient context for this description. We've talked a good bit about the ancient literature of Ugarit, Israel's close neighbor to the north. In Ugaritic texts, the god Baal is called the one who rides the clouds. The description became an official title of Baal, whom the entire ancient Near Eastern world considered a deity of rank. To ancient people all over the Mediterranean, Israelite or not, the one who rides the clouds was a deity. His status as a god was unquestioned. Consequently, any figure to whom the title was attributed was a god. Old Testament writers were quite familiar with Baal. Baal was the main source of consternation about Israel's propensity toward idolatry. In an effort to make the point that Yahweh, the God of Israel, deserved worship instead of Baal, the biblical writers occasionally pilfered this stock description of Baal as Cloud Rider and assigned it to Yahweh. There is no one like God, O Jeshurun, who rides through the heavens to your help, and with his majesty through the skies. Deuteronomy 33:26. O kingdoms of the earth, sing to God, sing praise to the Lord, Selah, to the one who rides in the highest heavens of old. See, he gives forth his voice, a mighty voice. Psalm 68:32-33. Bless Yahweh, O my soul. O Yahweh, my God, you are very great. You clothe yourself with splendor and majesty. You who cover yourself with light, as with a garment, who stretch out the heavens like a tent curtain. The one who sets beams in the waters for his upper chambers, who makes clouds his chariot, who rides on the wings of the wind. Psalm 104:1-4. An oracle of Egypt. Look, Yahweh is riding on a swift cloud, and is coming to Egypt, and the idols of Egypt will tremble in front of him, and the heart of Egypt melts in his inner parts. Isaiah 19:1. The literary tactic made a theological statement. The effect was to displace or snub Baal and hold up Yahweh as the deity who legitimately rode through the heavens, surveying and governing the world. The lone exception to the pattern of using this unambiguous deity title of the God of Israel is Daniel 7:13. There, a second figure, a human figure, receives this description. The description was known across the ancient world as Baal's. No one questioned Baal's deity status. Daniel 7 therefore describes two powers in heaven, two Yahweh figures, since in all other places in the Old Testament, Yahweh is the cloud rider. Just as importantly, the one who rides the clouds in Daniel 7:13 receives everlasting kingship from the Ancient of Days. As we saw in the previous chapter, everlasting kingship belonged only to the Son of David. We've just filled in more of the Messianic mosaic. The ultimate Son of David, the Messianic King, will be both human, Son of Man, and deity, the rider of the clouds. That's precisely what we get in the New Testament. Jesus as Daniel's Son of Man, the cloud rider. With respect to New Testament studies, the descriptive phrase Son of Man is intensely debated. Since it means human one, and was a title used of prophets in the Old Testament, many scholars see no divine status attached to it. That's likely the case in most of the descriptions occurrences of Jesus. But when the New Testament writer quotes Daniel 7:13, it's a different story. The backdrop of Daniel 7 and the divine nature of the phrase must be willfully ignored to avoid a statement of deity. Two verses in Luke make a transparent connection between the profile of the suffering Messiah, anointed one, Greek, Christos, and the Son of Man phrase. For just as the lightning shines forth, flashing from one place under heaven to another place under heaven, so the Son of Man will be in his day. But first, it is necessary for him to suffer many things, and to be rejected by this generation. Luke 17:24-25. Was it not necessary that the Christ suffer these things and enter into his glory? Luke 24:26. But the most dramatic passage in regard to Jesus as the divine Son of Man is Matthew 26. The scene has Jesus standing before Caiaphas prior to his condemnation and crucifixion. Now those who had arrested Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. But Peter was following him from a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And he went inside and was sitting with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false testimony against Jesus in order that they could put him to death. And they did not find it, although many false witnesses came forward. And finally two came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it within 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said to him, "You reply nothing? What are these people testifying against you?" But Jesus was silent. And the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath by the living God that you tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said it. But I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power, and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes, saying, "He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have just now heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they answered and said, "He deserves death." Matthew 26:57-66. In what seems like a cryptic answer to a very clear question, Jesus quotes Daniel 7:13 to answer Caiaphas. The reaction is swift and unyielding. Caiaphas understood that Jesus was claiming to be the second Yahweh figure of Daniel 7:13, and that was an intolerable blasphemy. Jesus' answer provides the high priest with the accusation he needs for a death sentence, but also gives us a clear testimony of Jesus as the final Son of David, Yahweh incarnate, through whom Yahweh will reclaim the nations disinherited at Babel. As with the ancient conquest under Joshua, that dominion isn't going to come without conflict. But this time, there will be no failure at the end of the campaign. Yahweh's message of the Messianic mosaic to the hostile gods opposing his global Edenic vision was, "You'll never know what hit you." But he has one more thing to say to them before the kingdom is launched under Jesus. "You can try to stop my plans, but you're all going to die like men."
Another cliffhanger.
Chapter 30. Prepare to die. The close of the Old Testament period was a dark, desperate time. By the end, the vestige of Yahweh's portion, the family he had raised up through Abraham after forsaking the nations of Babel, consisted of only two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, collectively referred to as the Kingdom of Judah. But even as the hordes of Babylon, the army of Nebuchadnezzar, descended on Jerusalem for the last time, the prophets offered a glimmer of hope. Yes, Yahweh would punish his children for turning to other gods, but a remnant would survive. Yahweh's plan had not been overturned. He would send a servant who would ensure its survival. There would be an Edenic kingdom, but in the future, not in the Old Testament era. I've sketched the encrypted signals concerning the coming king and his kingdom in the last two chapters. Daniel 7, our stopping point in the previous chapter about the divine nature of the deliverer, linked his appearance with this message of hope in the wake of the exile. The kingdom of God had failed in the Old Testament, but it would rise from the ashes when the divine king made his appearance. That Messianic king would inaugurate a kingdom that would spread throughout the earth and eventually succeed in restoring Eden. These ideas are familiar. Less apparent, however, is the way the Old Testament characterizes the launching of God's kingdom as a war between gods and men. In this chapter, I want to briefly overview this vision. The Deuteronomy 32 worldview we've looked at many times looms large. The kingdom will come. The divine holy ones loyal to Yahweh and Yahweh's people are his agents to expand that kingdom. But the nations and the gods who rule them, princes in Daniel's description, will stand opposed. As the kingdom of God grows, the dominions of the dark powers will shrink, and their gods will ultimately perish. The kingdom will come. In the divine council scene of Daniel 7, the Son of Man, a second Yahweh figure, received an everlasting kingdom. But it is crucial to note that this kingdom came only in the wake of the council's decision to judge the four beasts, or empires, reported in the vision of Daniel, with which the chapter began. Daniel reported, "I continued watching until the beast was slain and its body was destroyed, and it was given over to burning with fire. And as for the remainder of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but a prolongation of their life was given to them for a season and a time. I continued watching in the visions of the night, and look, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and kingship that all the peoples, the nations, and languages would serve him. His dominion is a dominion without end, that will not cease, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed." Daniel 7, 11-14. A more precise description of this kingdom follows in verses 15-28. We need to look carefully at certain statements in this passage. "As for me, Daniel, my spirit was troubled within me, and the visions of my head terrified me. So I approached one of the attendants, and I asked him about the truth concerning all this, and he told me that he would make known to me the explanation of the matter. These great beasts, which are four in number, are four kings who will arise from the earth. But the holy ones of the Most High will receive the kingdom, and they will take possession of the kingdom forever, forever, and ever." Daniel 7, 15-18. In his vision, Daniel asks one of the standing divine attendants at the council meeting about the meaning of what he has seen. he learns that the beasts are kings, but the kingdom will be given to the holy ones of the Most High, who will never lose possession of it. Two items are noteworthy. First, the interpretation is interesting in that in verses 13 to 14, it was the divine Son of Man who received an everlasting kingdom from the Most High. We therefore have two recipients of this everlasting kingdom, the Son of Man and the holy ones of the Most High. We have to keep reading to discern who the holy ones are. Second, verses 13 to 14 didn't describe any conflict before the Son of Man received the kingdom, only that the four beasts had been judged before the kingdom was given. We can agree with Daniel that more information is needed. He asks the attendant, "Then I desired to make certain concerning the fourth beast that was different from all the others, exceedingly terrifying with its iron teeth and its claws of bronze. It devoured and crushed and stamped the remainder with its feet. And concerning the horns that were on its head, and concerning the other horn that came up, and before which three horns fell, and this horn had eyes and a mouth, speaking boastfully, and its appearance was larger than its companions. I continued watching, and this horn made war with the holy ones, and it prevailed over them, until the Ancient of Days came, and gave judgment to the holy ones of the Most High. And the time arrived, and the holy ones took possession of the kingdom." Daniel 7, 19 to 22. The chronology of events gets some clarification here. The fourth beast, obviously prior to its death in verse 11, makes war with the holy ones and defeats them. This causes the Most High to act on their behalf, and so they take possession of the kingdom, something that must follow the demise of the fourth beast. The interpretation and the chronology are reiterated in what follows. "And he said, the fourth beast is the fourth kingdom that will be on the earth, that will be different from all the other kingdoms, and it will devour the whole earth, and it will trample it, and it will crush it. And as for the 10 horns coming from it, from this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the earlier ones, and he will subdue 3 kings. And he will speak words against the Most High, and he will wear out the holy ones of the Most High, and he will attempt to change times and law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, and 2 times, and half a time. Then the court will sit, and his dominion will be removed, to be eradicated, and to be destroyed totally. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the nation," Hebrew, people, "of the holy ones of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him." This is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts terrified me greatly, and my face changed over me, but I kept the matter in my heart. Daniel 7, 23 to 28. The reference to the fourth beast, wearing out the holy ones of the Most High, harks back to his victory over the holy ones in verse 21. The enemy, this little horn, defeats the holy ones. In response, the divine council court holds session, the assembly Daniel was witnessing, to deal with, destroy the fourth beast. The result of that meeting, in verse 27, is that the kingdom is given to the nation of the holy ones of the Most High. Interestingly, earlier the kingdom had been given to the holy ones of the Most High, and before that, to the divine Son of Man. The passage is clear in one respect. Before the everlasting kingdom is received, the fourth beast is destroyed. It is less clear in terms of who inherits the kingdom. There are 3 candidates: the Son of Man, the holy ones of the Most High, and the nation of the holy ones of the Most High. The holy ones of the Most High. In the previous chapter, I briefly noted the parallel nature of the vision of Daniel 2 to this vision in Daniel 7. The kingdom received by these 3 parties is the kingdom from Daniel 2, 44 to 45, not made by human hands, that will never be destroyed, the kingdom of God. Bible readers and scholars, of course, argue about how best to identify the fourth kingdom. Daniel 2:44 makes the identification with Rome obvious enough, in that the kingdom of God appears at the time of the fourth kingdom. The New Testament, of course, has the kingdom of God inaugurated at the coming of Jesus during the Roman Empire, and yet still in the process of coming. The description of this kingdom has both divine and earthly aspects. This is just what we would expect, since God's goal of reviving a global Eden involves people, but is a supernatural rule. Considering the identity of the holy ones helps us see this anew. The phrase holy ones is a translation of Hebrew kedoshim, or kedoshim, in the case of the Aramaic in Daniel 7. The term can refer to the members of the divine council in heaven. However, the term can also refer to people. Several times in Leviticus, the people are referred to collectively as kedoshim. This again is not unexpected, since the imagery of the priesthood, tabernacle, and temple creates an analogy to the sacred space of God's throne room and those who have access to Yahweh in heaven, his divine family, the divine council. The range of usage for kedoshim helps us parse the holy ones of Daniel 7. The phrase refers to both human followers of Yahweh and the members of his divine council. Both families rule together in Yahweh's everlasting kingdom, along with the Yahweh in human form, the Son of Man, the risen Christ. We'll see more of how this works in upcoming chapters, but here's a preview. The kingdom of God is reborn at the first coming of Jesus. His arrival marks the beginning of the end of the rule of darkness and the initiation of Yahweh's reclamation of the nations ruled by the other gods. Jesus is the Son of Man, and the kingdom is his. Ruling with him will be the holy ones of Yahweh's and his council. Note in Daniel 7:27 that the kingdom is given to the nation of the holy ones of the Most High, but it is still referred to as God's kingdom, his kingdom. This is a subtle reference to joint rulership in God's kingdom. The nation of the holy ones refers to the human followers of Yahweh aligned with him and his council. As we'll see in later chapters, in New Testament theology, all believers, Jew or Gentile, are the people of God, having inherited the promises of the covenant with Abraham. The kingdom language of Daniel 7 informs us that all the nations once disinherited and ruled by corrupt gods will be made subject both to God and to his people. This is why the book of Revelation says of believers, "The one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, I will give him authority over the nations. I will grant to him to sit down with me on my throne, as I also have conquered, and have sat down with my Father on his throne." Revelation 2:26 and 3:21. A coming war of gods and men. The triumph of the kingdom of God will not come before the final conflict known in Scripture as the day of the Lord. The words of Zechariah 14 are telling. "Look, a day is coming for Yahweh when your plunder will be divided in your midst. I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, and they will loot the houses, and the women will be raped. Half of the city will go into exile, but the remainder of the people will not be cut off from the city. Then Yahweh will go forth and fight against those nations, like when he fights on a day of battle. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in half from east to west by a very great valley, and half of the mountain will withdraw toward the north, and the other half toward the south. And you will flee by the valley of my mountain, because the valley of the mountains will reach Azal. And you will flee like you fled from the earthquake in the days of King Uzziah of Judah. And Yahweh my God will come, and all the holy ones with him." Zechariah 14, 1-5. Yahweh comes with his heavenly army at the day of the Lord to disarm and defeat the hostile supernatural powers. Isaiah said the same thing. And it shall happen on that day, Yahweh will punish the host of heaven in heaven, and the kings of the earth on the earth. And they will be gathered in a gathering like a prisoner in a pit. And they will be shut in a prison and be punished after many days. And the full moon will be ashamed, and the sun will be ashamed. For Yahweh of hosts will rule on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and before his elders in glory. Isaiah 24, 21-23. Yahweh will rule before his council, here called elders, having punished both his human foes, kings of the earth, and his supernatural enemies, the host of heaven in heaven, in order to reestablish his rule in his earthly abode, Mount Zion. What does the punishment of the gods entail? For that, we return to Psalm 82, where we got our first exposure to Yahweh's counsel in this book. In the first few verses of that psalm, Yahweh was standing in the council to accuse his divine sons of corruption. Instead of governing the nations in righteousness, the gods who had received the disinherited nations after the Babel incident had led the people astray, away from the Most High. Their time comes at the climax of the kingdom, when Yahweh reclaims the nations from them. The final verses portend their fate. The God of Israel speaks. I have said, you are gods, and sons of the Most High, all of you. However, you will die like men, and you will fall like one of the princes. Psalm 82, 6-7. The psalmist then exclaims, Rise up, O God, judge the earth, because you shall inherit all the nations. Psalm 82, 8. The rule of the gods will be ended when the Most High reclaims the nations he once disinherited. Daniel 7 makes clear that Yahweh's loyal divine and human families will share that rule. The future reinheritance of the nations. The day of the Lord is a time of judgment, but it is also cast in Scripture as a time of rejoicing for Yahweh's people. When the rule of the gods begins to crumble, Yahweh will call his own from among the nations. Isaiah 66, a passage that plays a crucial role in explaining the explosion of the gospel after the resurrection, describes the judgment and hope looming in a time future to the Old Testament period. For Yahweh enters into judgment on all flesh with fire and his sword, and those slain by Yahweh shall be many. Those who sanctify themselves and those who cleanse themselves to go into the gardens after the one in the middle, eating the flesh of swine and detestable things and rodents together, shall come to an end, declares Yahweh. And I, their works and thoughts, am about to come to gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and see my glory. And I will set a sign among them, and I will send survivors from them to the nations, Tarshish, Ul, and Lud, who draw the bow, Tubal, and Javan, the faraway coastlands that have not heard of my fame, and have not seen my glory. And they shall declare my glory among the nations, and bring all your countrymen from all the nations as an offering to Yahweh on horses and chariots, and in litters, and on mules and camels, to my holy mountain, Jerusalem, says Yahweh. Just as the sons of Israel bring an offering in a clean vessel to the house of Yahweh, and indeed, I will take some of them as priests, and the Levites, says Yahweh. For just as the new heavens and earth that I am about to make shall stand before me, declares Yahweh, so shall your descendants and your name stand. Isaiah 66, 16-22. Incredible as it sounds, people from the disinherited nations will return to Yahweh, out from under the dominion of their gods. Where Israel failed in that mission as a kingdom of priests, Yahweh himself will succeed. He will be the agent for his own mission. This is the story of how Eden will be reborn, a story told by the New Testament. I'll have more to say about the final conflict. There are other startling connections to the divine council worldview in eschatology, but we don't have to wait until the end times for New Testament connections to the supernatural worldview of the Old Testament. In that regard, the New Testament hits the ground running. Section summary. The story of Israel's monarchy is about more than David's battle with Goliath, his guerrilla war with Saul, the impulsive affair with Bathsheba, and his son Solomon's accumulation of wisdom and wives. We tend to be fixated on Saul, David, and Solomon because that's normally the exposure we get to the books from Samuel through Malachi. But there's more to these Old Testament books, almost half the Bible, than stories about kings. As intriguing as Israel's kings were, the men who wrote the monarchy's history weren't aiming at producing biographies. Their messaging was primarily theological. They had a story to tell about the spiritual cause and effect of Israel's failure, the wrath of God, and Yahweh's plan to prevent his original Edenic goal from being a legacy of ashes. The historical books and the writings of the prophets operate within the scope of the supernatural worldview of the biblical writers. The nations were still under the domain of hostile foreign gods. Israel was in constant conflict with enemy nations. In the time of the judges, spiritual and moral apostasy prevailed. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The failure of the conquest produced, instead of the Edenic rule of God reborn, something akin to the lawless American West. The anarchy culminated in the demand for a king. The choice came too early and with a misguided motive. But Yahweh had begun planning for David's rise even before he was born, via the ministry of Samuel, the last judge, as well as a priest, prophet, and anointer of kings. David eventually rose to prominence, but the fraternal conflict between Saul, chosen by rebellious Israelites for his height, and David, chosen by Yahweh for his heart, was emblematic of the unseen spiritual war for the land and the people. The vestiges of the Rephaim persisted, and the Ark of the Covenant and the Tabernacle were at separate locations dividing the priesthood. The crisis points were eventually resolved. David's men eliminated Goliath's brothers. Solomon reunited the Ark and the Tabernacle after the construction of the temple. The land promised to Abraham came under Solomon's rule and jurisdiction. Then, everything fell apart in the wake of Solomon's death. Two things happened during the dual death spirals of the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Yahweh called prophets, assured them of his presence and power through divine encounter, and decreed a new covenant, a new solution to the reestablishment of Edenic rule. In the bitterest of ironies, Babylon would swallow up Yahweh's inheritance. The tables seemed completely turned, but appearances can be deceiving. The real irony, as prophets like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Habakkuk informed anyone who would listen, was that Babylon was Yahweh's tool. Even as Judah was taking its last gasp, Yahweh was engineering the circumstances of an everlasting kingdom that could not be contained by geography. It would be ruled by a man who was also God, whose identity must be concealed long enough for him to die and rise again, so that the curse of sin would be overturned, the Lord of the dead would lose his authority, and the eternal life of Eden would encircle the earth. All of that would play out in New Testament theology. Scholars have long thought of that narrative in two phases: the kingdom already, and the kingdom not yet.
I buy the last two chapters. Those are clean. It's connecting it to all these spiritual realms that's different, that's interesting. Very, very intriguing. Let's see, we're on 265. I think there are 2 or 3 more parts. The kingdom already, the kingdom not yet, and then an epilogue. Let's see, how many more pages? Got about 120 more pages. I think I might call it. I've had a lot of study for today. I'm going an hour 40 minutes on this one. I feel myself getting tired. It's hard to focus. But these are interesting ideas. Yes, very, very intense. And like I said, I kind of buy the already, the not yet, all that type of stuff. I buy the reinheritance of the nations. There's some particulars that I struggle with, but overall, he's quite compelling. And like I said, there are some verses that just don't even make any sense if you don't understand these things. I'm curious what his interpretation of Revelation is. Alright guys, well, I think that'll do it for me. Rafe, it was so good to be able to meet with you and interact with you today, and everyone who popped in on the other channels. Appreciate that. And I hope you get some good rest tonight, and that you're prepared to worship God tomorrow in spirit and in truth. And may He bless you and keep you and make His face to shine upon you. Thank you so much, guys. Really enjoyed it. Have a good evening, and I will see you guys probably early next week. Take care. Bye now. God bless.